My name is Kristen McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. Thank you for joining our commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the opening statement of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. Justice Robert H. Jackson took a 15-month leave of absence from the United States Supreme Court to serve as the U.S. Chief of Counsel in Nuremberg. He led the development of the agreement that established the tribunal and enumerated and defined the crimes: common plan or conspiracy to wage aggressive war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Justice Jackson wrote and rewrote his opening statement over the course of many weeks. He sought input from his assistants and the other prosecutors and incorporated their thoughts into his edits. At the time of its delivery, and still today, the opening statement is hailed as a masterpiece. Justice Jackson spoke for more than 3 hours at the podium in Nuremberg. Our version of his opening statement is not quite that long, but then again, we don't need to pause for the interpreters to catch up. We have assembled for you a snapshot of the world in which the Jackson Center lives. We've asked students, teachers, professors, speakers, lecturers, international prosecutors, former United Nations staff, judges, justice officials, Jackson Center board members, volunteers, and staff, and some friends in Nuremberg to take a moment out of their lives to read a part of this speech. This speech continues to stand as a hallmark and inspiration for the international humanitarian legal community, all those concerned with how people are treated and the rule of law, each of us, and we hope each of you.
My name is Ben Ferencz. I'm speaking to you from Delray Beach, Florida. I am honored and pleased to participate in a celebration by the Jackson Center, and because it is trying to keep alive the goals and aspirations of Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, who headed the American delegation at the International Military Tribunal. And his remarks were really poignant and appropriate and beautiful. And so I'll be forgiven if I just read them and see where do we go from there. He said, "May it please your honors, the privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish has been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. That 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason."
This tribunal, while it is novel and experimental, is not the product of abstract speculations, nor is it created to vindicate legalistic theories. This inquest represents the practical effort of 4 of the most mighty of nations, with the support of 15 more, to utilize international law to meet the greatest menace of our times, aggressive war. The common sense of mankind demands that law shall not stop with the punishment of petty crimes by little people. It must also reach men who possess themselves of great power and make deliberate and concerted use of it to set in motion evils which leave no home in the world untouched. It is a cause of that magnitude that the United Nations will lay before your honors. In the prisoner's dock sit 20-odd broken men, reproached by the humiliation of those they have led almost as bitterly as by the desolation of those they have attacked. Their personal capacity for evil is forever past. It is hard now to perceive in these men as captives the power of which, as Nazi leaders, they once dominated much of the world and terrified most of it. Merely as individuals, their fate is of little consequence to the world.
What makes this inquest significant is that these prisoners represent sinister influences that will lurk in the world long after their bodies have returned to dust. We will show them to be living symbols of racial hatreds, of terrorism and violence, and of the arrogance and cruelty of power. They are symbols of fierce nationalisms and of militarism, of intrigue and war-making, which have embroiled Europe generation after generation, crushing its manhood, destroying its homes, and impoverishing its life. They have so identified themselves with the philosophies they conceived and with the forces they directed that any tenderness to them is a victory and an encouragement to all the evils which are attached to their names. Civilization can afford no compromise with the social forces which would gain renewed strength if we deal ambiguously or indecisively with the men in whom those forces now precariously survive.
What these men stand for, we will patiently and temperately disclose. We will give you undeniable proofs of incredible events. The catalog of crimes will omit nothing that could be conceived by a pathological pride, cruelty, and lust for power. These men created in Germany, under the Führerprinzip, a national socialist despotism equaled only by the dynasties of the ancient East. They took from the German people all those dignities and freedoms that we hold natural and inalienable rights in every human being. The people were compensated by inflaming and gratifying hatreds towards those who were marked as scapegoats. Against their opponents, including Jews, Catholics, and free labor, the Nazis directed such a campaign of arrogance, brutality, and annihilation as the world has not witnessed since the pre-Christian era. They excited the German ambition to be a master race, which of course implies serfdom for others. They led their people on a mad gamble for domination. They diverted social energies and resources to the creation of what they thought to be an invincible war machine. They overran their neighbors. To sustain the master race in its war-making, they enslaved millions of human beings and brought them into Germany, where these hapless creatures now wander as displaced persons. At length, bestiality and bad faith reached such excess that they aroused the sleeping forces of imperiled civilization. Its united efforts have ground the German war machine to fragments. But the struggle has left Europe a liberated yet prostrate land where a demoralized society struggles to survive. These are the fruits of the sinister forces that sit with these defendants in the prisoner's dock.
In justice to the men and to the nations associated in this prosecution, I must remind you of certain difficulties which may leave their mark on this case. Never before in legal history has an effort been made to bring within the scope of a single litigation the developments of a decade, covering a whole continent, involving a score of nations, countless individuals, and innumerable events. Despite the magnitude of the task, the world has demanded immediate action. This demand has had to be met, though perhaps at the cost of finished craftsmanship. To my country, established courts, following familiar procedures, applying well-thumbed precedents, dealing with the legal consequences of local and limited events, seldom commence a trial within a year of the event in litigation. Yet less than 8 months ago today, the courtroom in which you sit was an enemy fortress in the hands of the SS troops. Less than 8 months ago, nearly all our witnesses and documents were in enemy hands. The law had not been codified, no procedures had been established, no tribunal was in existence, no usable courthouse stood here, none of the hundreds of tons of official German documents had been examined. No prosecuting staff had been assembled. Nearly all of the present defendants were at large, and the 4 prosecuting powers had not yet joined in common cause to try them. I should be the last to deny that this court, this case, may very well suffer from incomplete research, and quite likely will not be the example of professional work which any of the prosecuting nations would normally wish to sponsor. It is, however, a completely adequate case to the judgment we shall ask you to render, and its fuller development we shall be obliged to leave to historians, because we have not had the time to examine all of the sources of evidence that might be available.
Before I discuss the particulars of the evidence we shall offer, some general considerations which may affect the credit of this trial in the eyes of the world should be candidly faced. There is dramatic disparity between the circumstances of the accusers and of the accused that might discredit our work if we should falter, in even minor matters, in being fair and temperate. Unfortunately, the nature of these crimes is such that both prosecution and judgment must be by victor nations over vanquished foes. The worldwide scope of the aggressions carried out by these men has left but few real neutrals. Either the victors must judge the vanquished, or we must leave the defeated to judge themselves. After the First World War, we learned the futility of the latter course. The former high station of these defendants, the notoriety of their acts, and the adaptability of their conduct to provoke retaliation make it hard to distinguish between the demand for a just and measured retribution and the unthinking cry for vengeance which arises from the anguish of war. It is our task, so far as humanly possible, to draw the line between the two. We must never forget the record on which we judge these defendants today is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. We must summon such detachment and intellectual integrity to our tasks that this trial will commend itself to posterity as fulfilling humanity's aspirations to do justice.
At the very outset, let us dispose of the contention that to put these men to trial is to do them an injustice, entitling them to some special consideration. These defendants may be hard-pressed men, but they are not ill-used men. Let us see what alternative they would have to being tried. More than a majority of these prisoners surrendered to or were tracked down by the forces of the United States. Could they expect us to make American custody a shelter for our enemies against the just wrath of our allies? Did we spend American lives to capture them only to free them from punishment? Under the principles of the Moscow Declaration, those suspected war criminals who are not to be tried internationally must be turned over to individual governments for trial at the scene of their outrages. Many less responsible and less culpable American-held prisoners than these have been and will continue to be turned over to other United Nations for local trial. If these defendants should succeed for any reason in escaping the condemnation of this tribunal, or if they obstruct or abort this trial, those who are American-held prisoners would be delivered up, of course, to our continental allies. For these defendants, however, we have set up this international tribunal, and the United States has undertaken the burden of participating in a complicated effort to give them fair and dispassionate hearings. That is the best protection to any man with a defense worthy of being heard.
If these men are the first war leaders of a defeated nation to be prosecuted in the name of the law, they are also the first to be given a chance to plead for their lives in the name of the law. Realistically, the charter of this tribunal, which gives them a hearing, is also the source of their only hope. It may be that these men of troubled conscience, whose only wish is that the world forget them, do not regard a trial as a favor. But they do have a fair opportunity to defend themselves, represented here by able counsel who have shown their capacity to handle their case with credit and who have acted with courage. And these men now enjoy a favor which these men, when in power, rarely extended to their fellow countrymen. despite the fact that public opinion may already condemn their acts. We agree here that they must be given a presumption of innocence, and we accept the burden of proving criminal acts and the responsibility of each of these defendants for their commission. When I say that we will not ask for convictions unless we prove crime, I do not mean mere technical or incidental transgressions of international conventions. We charge guilt on planned and intended conduct that involves moral as well as legal wrong. And we do not mean conduct that is natural and human, even if illegal, cutting of corners, such as many of us might well have committed had we been in the defendant's positions. It is not because they yielded to the normal frailties of human beings that we accuse them. It is their abnormal and inhuman conduct which brings them to this bar.
We will not ask you to convict these men on the testimony of their foes. There is no count in the indictment that cannot be proved by books and records. The Germans were always meticulous record keepers, and these defendants had their share of Teutonic passion for thoroughness in putting things on paper. Nor were they without vanity. They arranged frequently to be photographed in action. We will show you their own films. You will see their own conduct and hear their own voices as these defendants reenact for you some of the events in the course of the conspiracy. We would also make clear that we have no purpose to incriminate the whole German people. We know that the Nazi Party was not put in power by the majority of the German vote. We know it came to power by an evil alliance between the most extreme of Nazis, revolutionists, the most unrestrained of German reactionaries, and the most aggressive of German militarists. If the German populace had willingly accepted the Nazi program, no stormtroopers would have been needed in the early days of the party, and there would have been no need for concentration camps or the Gestapo's, both of which institutions were inaugurated as soon as the Nazis gained control of the German state. Only after these lawless innovations proved successful at home were they taken abroad.
The German people should know by now that the people of the United States held them in no fear and in no hate. It is true that the Germans have taught us the horrors of modern warfare, but the ruin that lies from the Rhine to the Danube shows that we, no more than our allies, have not been dull pupils. If we are not awed by German fortitude and proficiency in war, and if we are not persuaded of their political maturity, we do not respect their skills in the arts of peace, their technical competence, and the sober, industrious, and self-disciplined character of the masses of the German people. In 1933, we saw the German people recovering prestige in the commercial, industrial, and artistic world after the effect of the last war. We beheld their progress neither with envy nor malice. The Nazi regime interrupted this progress. The recoil of the Nazi aggression has left Germany in ruins. The Nazi readiness to pledge the German word without hesitation and to break it without shame has fastened upon German diplomacy a reputation for duplicity that will handicap it for years. Nazi arrogance has made the boast of the master race a taunt that will be thrown at Germans the world over for generations. The Nazi nightmare has given the German name a new and sinister significance throughout the world, which will retard Germany a century. The German, no less than the non-German world, has accounts to settle with these defendants.
The fact of the war and the course of the war, which is the central theme of our case, is history. From September 1st, 1939, when the German armies crossed the Polish frontier, until September 1942, when they met epic resistance at Stalingrad, German arms seemed invincible. Denmark and Norway, the Luxembourg, Balkans and Africa, Poland and the Baltic states, and part of Russia, all had been overrun and conquered by swift, powerful, well-aimed blows. That attack on the peace of the world is the crime against international society, which brings into international cognizance crimes in its aid and preparation, which otherwise might be only internal concerns. It was aggressive war, which the nations of the world had renounced. It was war in violation of treaties, by which the peace of the world was sought to be safeguarded. This war did not just happen. It was planned and prepared for over a long period of time and with no small skill and cunning. The world has perhaps never seen such a concentration and stimulation of the energies of any people as that which enabled Germany 20 years after it was defeated, disarmed, and dismembered to become so near carrying out its plan to dominate Europe. Whatever else we may say of those who were the authors of this war, they did achieve a stupendous work in organization. And our first task is to examine the means by which these defendants and their fellow conspirators prepared and incited Germany to go to war.
In general, our case will disclose these defendants all uniting at some time with the Nazi Party in a plan which they well knew could be accomplished only by the outbreak of war in Europe. Their seizure of the German state, their subjugation of the German people, their terrorism and extermination of dissident elements, their planning and waging of war, their calculated, planned, and ruthless conduct of warfare, their deliberate and planned criminality towards conquered people, all of these were ends which they acted in concert. And all of these phases of the conspiracy was a common one to these defendants. And it was a conspiracy which reached one goal, only to set out for another and more ambitious one. We shall also trace for you the intricate web of organizations which these men formed to accomplish these ends. We will show you how the entire structure of offices and officials was dedicated to the criminal purposes and committed to the use of criminal methods planned by these defendants and their co-conspirators, many of whom war and suicide have put beyond reach.
It is my purpose to open the case, particularly under count 1 of the indictment, and to deal with the common plan or conspiracy to achieve ends possible only by resort to crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. My emphasis will not be on individual barbarities and perversions, which may have occurred independently of any central plan. One of the dangers ever present is that in this trial, it may be protracted by details of particularly wrongs and that we will become lost in the wilderness of single instances. Covering so much space, great condensation must take place if we're to present this case within the time allotted to us to live, let alone the time to which we should devote to this trial. Nor will I now dwell on the activity of individual defendants, except as it may contribute to the expansion of the common plan. The cases presented by the United States will be concerned with the brains and authority back of all crimes. These defendants were men of station and rank, which does not soil its hands with blood. These were men who know how to use the lesser folk as tools. We want to reach the planners and designers, the insiders and the leaders, without whose evil architecture the world would not have been for so long scourged with the violence and lawlessness and racked with the agonies and convulsions of this terrible war.
I shall first take up the lawless road by which these men came to possess the power. The chief instrumentality of cohesion in plan and in action was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, known as the Nazi Party. Some of the defendants were with it from the beginning. Others joined only after success seemed to have validated its lawlessness, or power had invested it with an immunity from the processes of the law. Adolf Hitler became its supreme leader, or Führer, in 1921. On the 24th of February 1920 at Munich, it publicly had proclaimed its program. I shall not undertake to read it in full. Some of its purposes would of course commend themselves to many good citizens, such as the demands for profit sharing in the great industries, generous development of provisions for old age, creation of a healthy middle class, a land reform suitable to national requirements, and raising the habits, the standards of health. It had in its program, of course, items of strong appeal. It also made a strong appeal to that sort of nationalism, which in ourselves we call patriotism, and in our rivals, chauvinism. It demanded equality of rights for the German people in its dealing with other nations and the abolition of the peace treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain. It demanded the union of all Germans on the basis of the right of self-determination of peoples to form a great Germany. It demanded land and territory, colonies, I'm quoting, land and territory, colonies for the enrichment of our people and the settlement of our surplus population. All of these were legitimate objectives if they were to be obtained without resort to aggressive warfare.
The Nazi Party, however, from its inception, contemplated war. In its Munich Declaration of 1920, it demanded the abolition of mercenary troops and the formation of a national army. It proclaimed that in view of the enormous sacrifice of life and property demanded of a nation by every war, personal enrichment through war must be regarded as a crime against the nation. We demand, therefore, ruthless confiscation of all war profits. I do not mention this provision to criticize it. I wish it were universal. I merely point out that in a time of peace in 1920, war was a preoccupation of the Nazi Party, and it started the work of making war less offensive to the masses of the people and progressed rapidly from that point on. With this, it combined a program of physical training and sports for youth, which became, as we shall show you, the cloak for a secret program of military training. The Nazi Party declaration committed its members to an anti-Semitic program. It declared that no Jew or person of non-German blood could be a member of the nation. Such persons were to be disenfranchised, disqualified for office, subject to the alien laws, and entitled to nourishment only after the German population had first been provided for. All who entered Germany after August 2nd, 1914, were to be required to depart, and all non-German immigration was prohibited. The significance of this early declaration is that it became the publicly known and avowed policy of this party, which every man who joined in forwarding its purposes knew and understood.
The party also avowed, even in those early days, an authoritarian and totalitarian program for Germany. It demanded creation of a strong central power with unconditional authority, nationalization of all businesses which had become amalgamated, and a reconstruction of the national system of education, quoting, which must aim at teaching the pupil to understand the idea of the state. Its hostility to civil liberties and freedom of the press was distinctly announced in these words, quoting, "It must be forbidden to publish newspapers which do not conduce to the national welfare. We demand the legal prosecution of all tendencies in art or literature of a kind likely to disintegrate our life as a nation, and the suppression of institutions which might militate against the above requirements, of course, as interpreted by the Nazis." The forecast of religious prosecution was there, but it was clothed in the language of religious liberty. The Nazi program stated, "We demand liberty for all religious denominations in the state." It didn't stop there, but it continues with the limitation, so far as they are not a danger to it and do not militate against the morality and the moral sense of the German race. Of course, again, according to their conception.
The party program foreshadowed the campaign of terrorism. It announced, quoting, "We demand ruthless war upon those whose activities are injurious to the common interests," and it demanded that such offenses be punished with death. It is significant that the leaders of this party interpreted this program as a belligerent one, certain to precipitate conflict. The party platform concluded, quoting, "The leaders of the party swear to proceed regardless of consequences if necessary, at the sacrifice of their lives towards the fulfillment of the foregoing points. It is this leadership corps of the party, not its entire membership, that stands accused before you as a criminal organization. We have not sought to include every person who may at some time have supported the Nazi Party, but only the leadership corps, which pledged itself to achieve its ends at the risk of its lives, their lives. Let us now see how the leaders of the party fulfilled their pledge to proceed regardless of consequences. Obviously, their foreign objectives, which were nothing less than to undo international treaties and to wrest territory from foreign control, as well as most of their internal program, which could be accomplished only by possession of the machinery of the German state. The first effort, accordingly, was to subvert the Weimar Republic by the violent revolution. An abortive putsch at Munich in 1923 landed many of them in jail. A period of meditation which followed produced Mein Kampf, henceforth the source of the law to the party workers and a source of considerable revenue to its supreme leader. The Nazi plans for the violent overthrow of the feeble republic then turned to plans for its capture. No greater mistake could be made than to think of the Nazi Party in terms of the loose organizations which we of the Western world call political parties. In discipline, structure, and method, the Nazi Party was not adapted to the democratic process of persuasion. It was an instrument of conspiracy and of coercion. The party was now organized to take over power in the German state by winning support of a majority of the German people. It was organized to seize power in defiance of the will of the people.
The Nazi Party, under the Führerprinzip, was bound by an iron discipline into a pyramid, with the Führer, Adolf Hitler, at the top and broadening into a numerous leadership corps composed of overlords of a very extensive party membership at the base. By no means all of those who have supported the movement in one way or another were actual party members. The membership took the party oath, which in effect amounted to an abdication of personal intelligence and moral responsibility. This was the oath. I vow inviolable fidelity to Adolf Hitler. I vow absolute obedience to him and to the leaders he designates for me. Nor did they take this vow with their tongue in their cheeks. The membership in daily practice followed its leaders with an idolatry and self-surrender more Oriental than Western. We shall not be obliged to guess as to the motives or goals of the Nazi Party. The immediate aim was to undermine the Weimar Republic. The order to all party members to work to that end was given in a letter from Hitler of August 24, 1931, to Rosenberg. Of this letter we will produce the original. And Hitler complains to Rosenberg about an article appearing in his newspaper. He says that the tendency of the article is to prevent on our part a crumbling away from the present form of government. I myself am traveling all over Germany to achieve exactly the opposite. May I therefore ask if my own paper will not stab me in the back with tactically unwise articles.
Captured film will enable us to present to you the defendant, Alfred Rosenberg, who from the screen will himself tell you the story. The SA practiced violent interference with the elections in Germany. We have the reports of the SD describing in detail how its members violated the secrecy of elections in order to identify those who opposed them. The report on May the 7th, 1938 will be offered to you in due course and points out exactly the method by which some members of the election committee marked all of the ballots with numbers and made up a list. And it points out how this resulted in, it was marked with skim milk, by the way, and points out how they were then enabled to bring back the markings and to identify all those who ventured to oppose the Nazi Party in the elections.
The party activity, in addition to all the familiar forms of political contest that we know about, took on an aspect of a rehearsal for warfare. It utilized a party formation, which has been described to you in the indictment as the SA. This was a voluntary organization of youthful and fanatical Nazis trained for the use of violence under semi-military discipline. Its members began by acting as bodyguards for the Nazi leaders, and they rapidly expanded from defensive to offensive tactics. They became disciplined ruffians for breaking up of opposition meetings and the terrorization of adversaries. They boasted that their task was to make the Nazi Party the masters of the streets. The SA was the parent organization of a number of others, such as the SS, formed in 1925 and distinguished throughout this evidence for the fanaticism and cruelty of its members. Then there was the SD and the secret state police, the infamous Gestapo, formed in 1934, immediately after the Nazi ascension to power.
A glance at the charts, and we shall offer to you in evidence in due course a complete chart of the Nazi Party. I'll not take time to point out more than these things significant at this point in the argument. It was organized on semi-military lines. It had chiefs of staff of the stormtrooper. It had an elite guard and a motor corps, and it had a flying corps. It had a chief of legal office, the defendant Frank headed it, and a party Supreme Court, which passed upon the membership's activities. Throughout it had a death head corps too, which was not misnamed. It presents nothing, as you will see when this chart is placed in evidence, it presents nothing that resembles what you or I know in our respective countries as political parties. It had its own source of law in the Führer and then Subführer, more absolute than any party. It had its own courts and its own police. The conspirators set up a government within the party to exercise outside of the law every sanction that a legitimate state could exercise and many that it could not. Its chain of command was military, and its formations were martial in name as well as in function. It established elaborate administrative mechanisms to identify and liquidate spies and informers, to manage concentration camps, to operate death vans, and to finance the whole movement. Through concentric circles of authority, the Nazi Party, as its leadership boasted, eventually organized and dominated every phase of German life, but not until they had waged a bitter internal struggle characterized by the brutal criminality we charge here. In preparation for this phase of their struggle, they created the party police system, which became the pattern and the instrument of the police state, which was the final goal in their plan in Germany.
Party formations, including the leadership corps of the party, the SD, the SS, the SA, and the infamous secret state police or Gestapo. All these stand accused before you as criminal organizations. Organizations which, as we will prove from their own documents, were recruited only from recklessly devoted Nazis, ready in conviction and temperament to do the most violent of deeds to advance the common program. They terrorized and silenced democratic opposition and were able at length to combine with political opportunists, militarists, industrialists, monarchists, and political reactionaries. On the 30th of January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of the German Republic, an evil combination, represented in the prisoner's dock by its most eminent survivors, had succeeded in possessing itself of the machinery of the German government, a facade behind which they henceforth would operate to make a reality of the war of conquest which they had long plotted. The conspiracy had passed into its second phase.
We shall now consider the steps which embrace the most hideous of crimes against humanity, to which these conspirators resorted in perfecting control over the German state and in preparing Germany for the aggressive war which was indispensable to their ends. The Germans of the 1920s were a frustrated and baffled people as a result of defeat and the disintegration of their traditional government. The democratic elements which were trying to govern Germany through the new and feeble machinery of the Weimar Republic got inadequate support from the democratic forces of the rest of the world, including my country. It is not to be denied that Germany, when worldwide depression was added to her other problems, was faced with urgent and intricate problems and pressures in her economic and political life, which necessitated bold measures.
The internal measures by which a nation attempts to solve its problems are ordinarily no concern to other nations, but the Nazi program from the first was recognized as a desperate program for people still suffering the effects of an unsuccessful war. The Nazi policy embraced ends recognized from the beginning as obtainable only by a renewal and a more successful outcome of the war in Europe. The conspirators' answer to Germany's problem was nothing less than to plot the regaining of territories lost in the First World War and the acquisition of fertile lands of Central Europe by deposing and exterminating those who inhabited them. They also contemplated, and I want to emphasize this point, for it runs through the whole Nazi history. They also contemplated destroying or permanently weakening all other neighboring people as to win virtual domination over the Europe and probably of the world. The precise limits of their ambition we need not define, for it as illegal to wage aggressive war for small stakes as to larger ones. We find this period of two governments in Germany, the real and the ostensible, the forms of German Republic, were maintained for a time, and it was the outward and visible government, but the real authority in the state was the outside and above the law, and rested in the leadership core of the Nazi Party.
On February 27, 1933, less than a month after Hitler became chancellor, the Reichstag building was set on fire. The burning of this symbol of free parliamentary government was so providential for the Nazis that it was believed they staged the fires themselves. Certainly, when we contemplate their known crimes, we cannot believe they would shrink from mere arson. It was not necessary, however, to resolve the controversy as to who set the fire. The significant point is in the use that was made of the fire and the state of the public mind it produced. The Nazis immediately accused the Communist Party of instigating and committing the crime, and turned every effort to portray this single act of arson as the beginning of a communist revolution. Then, taking advantage of the hysteria, the Nazis met this phantom revolution with a real one. In the following December, the German Supreme Court, with the commendable courage and independence, acquitted the accused communist. But it was too late to influence the tragic course of events which the Nazi conspirators had set rushing forward.
All of these guarantees of the Weimar Constitution were swept away by the Hitler-Hindenburg Decree the morning after the fire. Now it must be said, in fairness to von Hindenburg, that the Constitution itself authorized him temporarily to suspend these fundamental rights, quoting, "If the public safety and order in the German Reich are considerably disturbed or endangered." It must also be acknowledged, in fairness, that President Ebert previously had invoked this power.
The Hitler-Hindenburg Decree of February 28, 1933 contained no such safeguards. The omission may not have been noted by Hindenburg. Certainly, he did not appreciate its effect. It left the Nazi police and party formations already existing and functioning under Hitler completely unrestrained and irresponsible. Secret arrest and indefinite detention without charges, without evidence, without hearing, without counsel became the method of inflicting inhuman punishment on any whom the Nazi police suspected or disliked. No court could issue an injunction or writ of habeas corpus or certiorari. The German people were in the hands of the police were in the hands of the Nazi Party, and the party was in the hands of a ring of evil men, of whom the defendants here before you are the surviving and representative leaders.
The Nazi conspiracy, as we shall show, always contemplated not merely overcoming current opposition, but it contemplated exterminating elements which could not be reconciled with the Nazi philosophy of the state. It not only sought to establish the Nazi new order, but to secure its sway, as Hitler predicted, for 1,000 years. The Nazis were never in doubt or disagreement as to what these dissident elements were. They were concisely described by one of them, Colonel General von Fritsch, on December 11th, 1938, in these words, which I emphasize because they identify so clearly the object of the Nazi program of extermination. He writes in a document which will be proven to you, quote, shortly after the First World War, I came to the conclusion that we should have to be victorious in 3 battles if Germany were to become powerful again. First, the battle against the working class. Hitler has won this. Second, against the Catholic Church, perhaps better expressed against ultramontanism. Third, against the Jews. That ends the quote.
The warfare against these elements was continuous. The battle in Germany was but a practice, skirmish for the worldwide drive against them. We have, in point of geography and of time, 2 crimes against humanity. One within Germany before and during the war, and 2 in occupied territory during the war. But these 2 are not separated in Nazi planning. They are a continuous unfolding of the Nazi plan to exterminate peoples and institutions, which might serve as a focus or instrument for overturning their new world order at any time or place. We consider these crimes against humanity in this opening address as manifestation of the one Nazi plan, and I propose to you to unfold to you our proposals of proof according to General von Fritsch's classification.
First, the battle against the working class. When Hitler came to power, there were in Germany 3 groups of trade unions. The General German Trade Union Confederation, with 28 affiliated unions, and the General Independent Employees Confederation, with 13 federated unions, together numbered 4.5 million members. The Christian Trade Union had over 1,250,000 members.
The working people of Germany, like the working people of other nations, had little to gain personally by war. While labor is usually brought around to the support of the nation at war, labor, by and large, is a pacific, though by no means a pacifist, force in the world. The working people of Germany had not forgotten in 1933 how heavy the yoke of the warlord can be. Moreover, the German working people were identified in the minds of the militarists with the revolution of 1918, when the workers joined with the revolting seamen and soldiers against a continuance of the First World War, an act for which German labor was never forgiven by the military crowd. The Nazi program required that this part of the German population not only be stripped of power to resist diversion of its scanty comforts to armament, but also wheedled or whipped into new and unheard of sacrifices as part of the Nazi war preparation. Labor must be cowed, and that meant its organizations and means of cohesion and defense must be destroyed. The purpose to regiment labor for the Nazi Party was avowed by Robert Ley in a speech to workers on May 2nd, 1933, in which he said this: "You may say what else do you want. You have the absolute power. True, we have the power, but we do not have the whole people. We do not have you workers 100%, and it is you whom we want. We will not let you be until you stand with us in complete, genuine acknowledgement."
The first Nazi attack was upon the 2 larger unions. On April 21, 1933, an order not even in the name of the government, but in the name of the Nazi Party, was issued by the conspirator Robert Ley, describing himself therein as Chief of Staff of the political organization of the NSDAP. This order was applicable to the Trade Union Confederation and the Independent Employees Confederation, the two largest of the German unions. It directed seizure of their properties and arrest of their principal leaders. The party order directed the party organs, which we here denounce as criminal associations, the SS and the SS, quote, to be employed for the occupation of the trade union properties and for the taking into custody of personalities who come into question, end quote. And it directed taking into protective custody of all chairmen and district secretaries of such unions and branch directors of the Labor Bank. These orders were carried out on May the 2nd, 1933. All funds of the labor unions, including pension and benefit funds, were seized. Union leaders were sent to concentration camps. A few days later, on May 10, 1933, Hitler appointed Robert Ley leader of the German Labor Front, which succeeded to confiscate all the union funds. The German Labor Front, a Nazi-controlled labor bureau, was then set up under Ley to teach the Nazi philosophy to the German workers and to weed out from industrial employment all who were backward in their lessons. Factory troops, as they were called, were organized and as a, quote, ideological shock squad within the factory, end quote. The party order provided the outside of the German Labor Front no other organization, whether of workers or employees, is to exist. On June 24, 1933, the remaining Christian trade unions were seized, pursuant to an order again of the Nazi Party signed by Ley.
On May 19, 1933, this time by a government decree, it was provided that trustees, and I quote the word trustees, of labor appointed by Hitler should regulate the conditions of all labor contracts, thereby replacing the former process of collective bargaining. On November 30, 1934, a decree, in quotes, regulating national labor, end of quotes, introduced the Führer principle into industrial relations. It provided that the owners of enterprises should be leaders or, quote, Führers, end of quote, and the workers should be the followers. And it authorized the owners / Führers to, quote, make decisions for employees and laborers in all matters concerning the enterprise, end of quotes. It was by such bait that the great German industrialists were induced to support the Nazi cause to their own ultimate ruin.
Not only did the Nazis thus dominate and regiment German labor, but they forced the youth into the ranks of the laboring people they had thus led into chains. Under a compulsory service decree on the 26th of June, 1935, young men and women between the ages of 18 and 25 were conscripted for labor. Thus was the purpose to subjugate German labor accomplished. In the words of Ley, the accomplishment consisted, and I'm quoting, in eliminating the association character of the trade unions and employees association, and in its place we have substituted the conception soldiers of work. The productive manpower of the German nation was thus brought under Nazi control. By these steps, the defendants won the battle to liquidate labor unions as potential opposition and were enabled to impose upon the working class of the burdens of preparing for aggressive warfare. Robert Ley, the field marshal of the battle against labor, answered our indictment with suicide. Apparently, he knew no better answer.
I take up the battle against the churches, the second in the described elements that must be defeated. The Nazi Party always was predominantly anti-Christian in its ideology, but we who believe in freedom of conscience and of religion base no charge of criminality on anybody's ideology. It is not because the Nazis themselves were irreligious or pagan, but because they persecuted others of the Christian faith that they become guilty of crime, and it is because the persecution was a step in the preparation for aggressive warfare that the offense becomes one of international consequence. To remove every moderating influence among the German people and to put its population on a total war footing, the conspirators devised and carried out a systematic and relentless repression of all Christian sects and churches.
We will ask you to convict the Nazis on their own evidence on this point. Martin Bormann in June of 1941 issued a secret decree on the relation of Christianity and National Socialism. I quote from it. With the party, its components, and attached units, the Führer has created for himself and thereby the German Reich leadership an instrument which makes him independent of the Church. All influences which might impair or damage the leadership of the people exercised by the Führer with the help of the NSDAP must be eliminated. More and more, the people must be separated from the churches and their organs, the pastors. Of course, the churches must and will, seen from their viewpoint, defend themselves against the loss of power. But never again must an influence on leadership of the people be yielded to the churches. This influence must be broken completely and finally. Only the Reich government, and by its direction, the party, its components, and attached units, have a right to leadership of the people, just as the deleterious influences of astrologers, seers, and other fakers are estimated and suppressed by the estate, so must the possibility of the church influence also be totally removed. Not until this has happened does the state leadership have influence on the individual citizens. Not until then are people and the Reich secure in their existence for all the future.
The party on 23 July 1939, from 2100 hours, carried out the third demonstration against Bishop Sproul. Participants about 2,500 to 3,000 were brought in from outside by bus, and so forth. The Rottenburg populace again did not participate in the demonstration. This town took rather a hostile attitude to the demonstrations. The action got completely out of hand of the party member responsible for it. The demonstrators stormed the palace, beat in the gates and doors. About 150 to 200 people forced their way into the palace, searched the rooms, threw files out of the windows, and rummaged through the beds in the rooms of the palace. One bed was ignited. Before the fire got to the other objects of equipment in the rooms and the palace, the flaming bed could be thrown from the window and the fire extinguished. The bishop was with Archbishop Grober of Freiburg and the ladies and gentlemen of his menage in the chapel at prayer. About 25 to 30 people pressed into this chapel and molested those present. Bishop Grober was taken for Bishop Sproul. He was grabbed by the robe and dragged back and forth. Finally, the intruders realized that Bishop Grober is not the one they are seeking. They could then be persuaded to leave the building. In the course of the action, the damage done, as well as the homage of the Rottenburg populace beginning today for the bishop, I shall immediately hand in a full report, after I am in the act of suppressing counter meetings. In case the Führer has instructions to give in this matter, I request that these be transmitted most quickly.
Later, Defendant Rosenberg wrote to Bormann reviewing the proposal of the church minister Corell to place the Protestant church under state tutelage and to proclaim Hitler its supreme head. Rosenberg was opposed, hinting that Nazism was to suppress the Christian church completely after the war. The persecution of all pacifist and dissenting sects, such as Jehovah's Witnesses and the Pentecostal Association, was particularly relentless and cruel. The policy toward the evangelical churches, however, was to use their influence for the Nazis' own purposes. In September 1933, Müller was appointed the Führer's representative with the power to deal with the affairs of the evangelical church in its relations to the state. Eventually, steps were taken to create a Reich bishop vested with power to control the church. A long conflict followed. Pastor Niemöller was sent to concentration camp, and extended interference with the internal discipline and administration of the churches occurred.
A most intense drive was directed against the Roman Catholic Church. After a strategic concordat with the Holy See, signed in July 1933 in Rome, which was never observed by the Nazi Party, a long and persistent persecution of the Catholic Church, its priesthood, and its members was carried out. Church schools and educational institutions were suppressed or subjected to the requirements of Nazi teaching inconsistent with the Christian faith. The property of the church was confiscated, and inspired vandalism directed against church property was left unpunished. Religious instruction was impeded, and the exercise of religion made difficult. Priests and bishops were laid upon, riots were stimulated to harass them, and many were sent to concentration camps. After the occupation of foreign soil, these persecutions went on with greater vigor than ever. We will present to you from the files of the Vatican the earnest protests made by the Vatican to Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, summarizing the persecutions to which the priesthood and the church had been subjected in this 20th century under the Nazi regime. Ribbentrop never answered them. He could not deny, and he dared not justify.
I was about to take up the crimes committed against the Jews. The most savage and numerous crimes planned and committed by the Nazis were those against the Jews. Those in Germany in 1933 numbered about 500,000. In the aggregate, they had made for themselves positions which excited envy, and had accumulated properties which excited the avarice of the Nazis. They were few enough to be helpless, and numerous enough to be held up as a menace. Let there be no misunderstanding about the charge of persecuting Jews. What we charge against these defendants is not those arrogances and pretensions which frequently accompany the intermingling of races and different peoples, and which are likely, despite the honest efforts of government, to produce regrettable crimes and convulsions. It is our purpose to show a plan and design to which all Nazis were fanatically committed, to annihilate all Jewish people. These crimes were organized and promoted by the party leadership, executed and protected by the Nazi officials, as we shall convince you by written orders of the secret state police itself.
The persecution of the Jews was a continuous and deliberate policy. It was a policy directed against other nations as well as against the Jews themselves. Anti-Semitism was promoted to divide and embitter the democratic peoples and to soften their resistance to the Nazi aggression. As Robert Lai himself declared, I quote, "The second German secret weapon is anti-Semitism, because if it is constantly pursued by Germany, it will become a universal problem which all nations will be forced to consider." Anti-Semitism also has been aptly credited with being a spearhead of terror. The ghetto was the laboratory for testing repressive measures. Jewish property was the first to be expropriated, but the custom grew and included similar measures against anti-Nazi Germans, Poles, Czechs, Frenchmen, and Belgians. Extermination of the Jews enabled the Nazis to bring a practiced hand to similar measures against Poles, Serbs, and Greeks. The plight of the Jew was a constant threat to opposition and discontent among other elements of Europe's population. Pacifists, conservatives, communists, Catholics, Protestants, socialists. It was, in fact, a threat to every dissenting opinion and to every non-Nazi's life.
The persecution policy against the Jews commenced with nonviolent measures such as disenfranchisement and discriminations against their religion and the placing of impediments in the way of success and economic life. It moved rapidly to organized mass violence against them, physical isolation in ghettos, deportation, forced labor, mass starvation, and extermination. The government, the party formations indicted before you as criminal organizations, the secret state police, the army, private and semi-public associations, and spontaneous mobs that were carefully inspired from official sources were all agencies that were concerned in this persecution. Nor was it directed against individual Jews for personal bad citizenship or unpopularity. The avowed purpose was the destruction of the Jewish people as a whole, an end in itself, as a measure of preparation for war and a discipline of conquered peoples. The conspiracy or common plan to exterminate the Jew was so methodically and thoroughly pursued that despite German defeat and Nazi prostration, this Nazi aim largely has succeeded. Only remnants of the European Jewish population remain in Germany, in the countries which Germany occupied, and in those which were her satellites or collaborators. Of the 9,600,000 Jews who lived in Nazi-dominated Europe, 60% are authoritatively estimated to have perished. 5,700,000 Jews are missing from the countries in which they formerly lived, and over 4,500,000 cannot be accounted for by the normal death rate nor by immigration, nor are they included among displaced persons. History does not record a crime ever perpetrated against so many victims or one carried out with such calculated cruelty.
You will have difficulty, as I have, to look into the faces of these defendants and believe that in this 20th century, human beings could inflict such sufferings, as well as be proved here on their own countrymen, as well as upon their so-called inferior enemies. Particular crimes and the responsibility of defendants for them are to be dealt with by the Soviet government's counsel when committed in the East, and by counsel for the Republic of France when committed in the West. I advert to them now only to show their magnitude as evidence of a purpose and a knowledge common to all defendants, of an unofficial plan rather than of a capricious policy of some individual commander, and to show a continuity of Jewish persecution from the rise of the Nazi conspiracy to its collapse, which forbids us to believe that any person could be identified with any part of a Nazi action with approving this most conspicuous item for their program.
The indictment itself recites many evidences of the anti-Semitic persecutions. The defendant Streicher led the Nazis in anti-Semitic bitterness and extremism. In March of 1942, he complained that Christian teachings have stood in the way of, quoting him, racial solution of the Jewish question in Europe, and quoted enthusiastically as the 20th century solution the Führer's proclamation of February 24, 1942, that, and I quote, the Jew will be exterminated. And on November 4, 1943, Streicher declared in Der Stürmer that the Jews, and I quote his words, have disappeared from Europe, and the Jewish reservoir of the East, from which the Jewish plague has for centuries beset the people of Europe, has ceased to exist. Streicher now has the infirmity to tell us he is only a Zionist, that he wants only to return the Jews to Palestine. But on May the 7th, 1942, he wrote, and I quote, "It is also not only a European problem, the Jewish question is a world question. Not only is Germany not safe in the face of the Jews as long as one Jew lives in Europe, but also the Jewish question is hardly solved in Europe so long as Jews live in the rest of the world."
And the defendant, Hans Frank, a lawyer by profession, I blush to say, summarized in his diary in 1944 the Nazi policy thus, and I quote, "The Jews are a race which has to be eliminated. Whenever we catch one, it is his end." And earlier, speaking of his function as Governor General of Poland, he confided in his diary this sentiment, quoting, "Of course, I cannot eliminate all lice and Jews in only a year's time." I could multiply endlessly this kind of Nazi ranting, but I will leave it to the evidence and turn to the fruit of this perverted thinking.
The most serious of actions against the Jews were outside of any law, but the law itself was employed to some extent. There were the infamous Nuremberg decrees of September 15, 1935. The Jews were segregated into ghettos and put into forced labor. They were expelled from their professions, Their property was expropriated. All cultural life, the press, the theater, and schools were prohibited among them. And the SD was made responsible for them. This was an ominous guardianship. It was ordered that an eventual act by the civilian population against the Jews is not to be prevented as long as this is compatible with the maintenance of order and security in the rear of fighting troops. And again, the first main goal of the German measures must be the strict segregation of Jewry from the rest of the population. In the execution of this, first of all is the seizing of the Jewish populace by the introduction of a registration order and similar appropriate measures. But it was desirable that the security police should not put in an immediate appearance, at least in the beginning, since the extraordinarily harsh measures were apt to stir even German circles. It had to be shown to the world that the native population itself took the first action by way of natural reaction.
Of course, it is self-evident that these uprisings were managed by both the government and the Nazi Party. If we were ever in doubt, we could resort to Streicher's memorandum of April 14, 1938, in which he states, "The anti-Jewish action of November 1938 did not arise spontaneously from the people." I still quote, "Part of the party formation have been charged with the execution of the anti-Jewish action."
Jews as a whole were fined 1 billion Reichsmarks. They were excluded from all businesses, and claims against insurance companies for their burned properties were confiscated, all by the decree of Defendant Göring. Synagogues were objects of a special vengeance. On November 10, 1938, the following order was given. I quote, "By order of the group commander, all Jewish synagogues in the area of Brigade 50 have to be blown up or set afire. The operation will be carried out in civilian clothing. Execution of the order will be reported."
Some 40 teletype messages from various police headquarters, which will be introduced to you, will tell the fury with which all Jews were pursued in Germany on those awful November nights. The SS troops were turned loose, and the Gestapo supervised. Jewish-owned property was destroyed. The Gestapo ordered 20 to 30,000 well-to-do Jews, and I quote the term well-to-do Jews, to be arrested. Concentration camps were to receive them, and the order provided that healthy Jews, fit for labor, were to be taken. As the German frontiers were expanded by war, so the campaign against the Jews expanded. The Nazi plan was never limited to extermination in Germany. Always. It contemplated extinguishing the Jew in Europe and often in the world. In the West, the Jews were killed and their property taken over by occupied countries. But the campaign achieved its zenith of savagery in the East. The Eastern Jew has suffered as no people ever suffered. Their sufferings were carefully reported to the Nazi authorities to show faithful adherence to the Nazi design. I shall refer only to enough of the evidence of these to show the extent of the Nazi design and common plan for killing Jews. If I should recite these horrors in words of my own, you would think me intemperate and unreliable. Fortunately, we need not take the word of any witness but the Germans themselves. I invite you now to look at a few of the vast number of captured German orders and reports that will be offered in evidence to see what a Nazi invasion meant. We will present such evidence as the report of Action Group A of October 15th, 1941, which boasts that in overrunning the Baltic states, I quote, native anti-Semitic forces were induced to start pogroms during the first hours after occupation. But it continues, and I quote, "From the beginning, it was to be expected that the Jewish problem in the East could not be solved by pogroms alone." In accordance with the basic orders received, however, the cleansing activities of the security police had to aim at a complete annihilation of the Jews. Special detachments, reinforced by selected units in Lithuania, partisan detachments. In Latvia, units of the Latvian Auxiliary Police, therefore performed extensive executions both in the towns and rural areas. The actions of the execution detachments were performed smoothly. The sum total of the Jews liquidated in Lithuania, I'm still quoting the report, amounts to 71,105. During the pogroms in Kovno, 3,800 Jews were eliminated, and in the smaller towns, about 1,200 Jews. In Latvia, up to now, a total of 30,000 Jews were executed. 500 were eliminated by pogroms in Riga.
Then there is a captured report from the Commissioner of Slusk on October 30, 1941, which describes these executions more in detail. Let me quote from it. The first lieutenant explained that the police battalion had received the assignment to effect the liquidation of all Jews here in the town of Slusk within 2 days. Then I requested him to postpone the action 1 day. However, he rejected this with the remark that he had to carry out this action everywhere and in all towns, and that only 2 days were allotted for Slusk. Within these 2 days, the town had to be cleared of Jews by all means. All Jews, without exception, were taken out of the factories and shops and deported in spite of our agreement. It is true that part of the Jews was moved by way of the ghetto, where many of them were processed and still segregated by me, but a large part was loaded directly on trucks and liquidated without further delay outside of the town. For the rest, as regards the execution of the action, I must point out to my deepest regret that the latter bordered already on sadism. The town itself offered a picture of horror during the action, with indescribable brutality on the part of both the German police officers and particularly the Lithuanian partisans. The Jewish people, but also among them white Ruthenians, were taken out of their dwellings and herded together. Everywhere in the town shots were to be heard, and in different streets the corpses of shot Jews accumulated. The white Ruthenians were in greatest distress to free themselves from the encirclement, regardless of the fact that the Jewish people, among whom were also tradesmen, were mistreated in a terribly barbarous way in the face of white Ruthenian people. The white Ruthenians themselves were also worked over with rubber clubs and rifle butts. There was no question of an action against the Jews anymore. It rather looked like a revolution.
Then there are reports which merely tabulate the numbers slaughtered. Another example relates that in Estonia, all Jews were arrested immediately upon the arrival of the Wehrmacht. And I call your attention to the fact that this is a report of the Wehrmacht, the army, which became implicated in this business, along with the SS. Jewish men and women above the age of 16 and capable of work were drafted for forced labor. Jews were subjected to all sorts of restrictions, and all Jewish property was confiscated. All Jewish males above the age of 16 were executed, with the exception of doctors and elders. Only 500 of an original 4,500 Jews remained. 37,180 persons have been liquidated by the SIPO and SD in White Ruthenia during October. In one town, 337 Jewish women, I'm quoting from the report, were executed for demonstrating a provocative attitude. In another, 380 Jews were shot for spreading vicious propaganda. And the report continues, listing town after town where hundreds upon hundreds of Jews were murdered. In one town, 3,000. In another, 33,771. In another, 3,145. In another, 410. All listed in detail.
Other accounts tell not of the slaughter so much as of the depths of degradation to which the tormentors stooped. For example, we will show the report made to Defendant Rosenberg about the Army and the SS in the area under Rosenberg's jurisdiction, which recited that, in the presence, I'm quoting, of SS man, a Jewish dentist has to break all gold teeth and fillings out of the mouths of German and Russian Jews before they are executed. It also says men, women, and children are locked into barns and burned alive. It says peasants, women, and children are shot on the pretext that they are suspected of belonging to bands.
We of the Western world heard of gas wagons in which Jews and political opponents were asphyxiated. We could not believe it. But here we will produce for you the report of May 16, 1942, from the German SS officer Becker to his supervisor in Berlin, and this is the story it tells. Gas vans in C Group can be driven to spot, which is generally stationed 10 to 15 kilometers from main road, only in dry weather. Since those to be executed become frantic if conducted to this place, such vans become immobilized in wet weather. Gas vans in Group D were camouflaged as cabin trailers, but vehicles well known to authorities and civilian population, which calls them death vans. The writer of letter ordered all men to keep as far away as possible during gassing. Unloading the van has atrocious spiritual and physical effect on the men who have to unload them, and they should be ordered not to participate in such work.
I shall not dwell on this subject longer than to quote one more sickening document which evidences the planned and systematic character of the Jewish persecutions. I hold an original report, written with Teutonic thoroughness as to detail, illustrated with photographs to authenticate its almost incredible text, and beautifully bound in leather with love and care bestowed on a proud work. It is the original report of the SS Brigade General Stroop in charge of the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, and Hans Frank was Governor General of Poland. Its title page carries the inscription, "The Jewish Ghetto in Warsaw no longer exists." I shall ask your honors to examine with care the photographs with which this document abounds, showing the destruction of this ghetto, showing the people driven before the flames with the title Jews and Bandits, women and children and old men. Not a man of fighting age in the picture except the German soldiers. The masses lined up against a wall for execution. The picture to illustrate the text showing that they jumped from the windows during the flames to escape. Now let us read what General Stroop says he did. The resistance put up by the Jews and bandits could only be suppressed by energetic actions of our troops day and night. The Reichsfuhrer SS ordered, therefore, on 23rd of April, 1948, the clearing out of the ghetto with utter ruthlessness and merciless tenacity. I, therefore, decided to destroy and burn down the entire ghetto without regard to the armament factories. These factories were systematically dismantled and then burned. The Jews usually left their hideouts, but frequently remained in the burning buildings and jumped out of the windows only when the heat became unbearable. They then tried to crawl with broken bones across the street into buildings which were not afire. Sometimes they changed their hideouts during the night into the ruins of burned buildings. Life in the sewers was not pleasant after the first week. Many times we could hear loud voices in the sewers. SS men or policemen climbed bravely through the manholes to capture these Jews. Sometimes they stumbled over Jewish corpses. Sometimes they were shot at. Tear gas bombs were thrown into the manholes and the Jews driven out of the sewers and captured. Countless numbers of Jews were liquidated in sewers and bunkers through blasting. The longer the resistance continued, the tougher became the members of the Waffen-SS, police, and Wehrmacht, who always discharged their duties in an exemplary manner. Frequently, Jews who tried to replenish their food supplies during the night or to communicate with neighboring groups were exterminated. This action eliminated, says the SS commander, I quote, a proved total of 56,065. To that, he says, we have to add the number killed through blasting, fire, etc., which cannot be counted. We hold that all atrocities against Jews were the manifestation and culmination of the Nazi plan to which every defendant in this box were a party. I know very well that some of these men did take steps to spare some particular Jew for some personal reason from the horrors that awaited unrescued Jews. Some protested that particular atrocities were excessive and discredited the general policy. While a few defendants may have shown some efforts to make specific exceptions to the policy of Jewish extermination, I have found no instance in which any defendant opposed the policy itself or sought to revoke or even modify it. Determination to destroy the Jew was a binding force which at all times cemented the elements of this conspiracy. On many internal policies, there were differences among the defendants, but there is not one of them who has not echoed the rallying cry of Nazism. Germany awake, Jewry perish.
How a government treats its inhabitants generally is thought to be no concern of other governments or of international society. Certainly few oppressions or cruelties would warrant the intervention of foreign powers, but the German mistreatment of Germans is now known to pass in magnitude and savagery any limits of what is tolerable by modern civilization. Other nations by silence would take a consenting part in such crimes. These Nazi persecutions, moreover, take character as international crimes because of the purpose for which they were undertaken.
The purpose, as we have seen, of getting rid of the influence of free labor, the churches, and the Jews was to clear their obstruction to the precipitation of aggressive war. If aggressive warfare, in violation of treaty obligation, is a matter of international cognizance, the preparations for it must also be of concern to the international community. Terrorism was the chief instrument for securing the cohesion of the German people in war purposes. Moreover, these cruelties in Germany served as atrocity practice to discipline the membership of the criminal organization to follow the pattern later in occupied countries.
Through the police formations that are before you accused as criminal organizations, the Nazi party leaders, aided at some point in their basic and notorious purpose by each of the individual defendants, instituted a reign of terror. These espionage and police organizations were utilized to hunt down every form of opposition and to penalize every nonconformity. These organizations early founded and administered concentration camps, Buchenwald in 1933 and Dachau in 1934. And Dachau lies but a few miles from here and but a few hours' drive. We hope this tribunal will visit this place and see the magnitude of the layout which goes with the concentration camp and the implements of torture that remain. But those notorious names were not alone. Concentration camps came to dot the German map and to number scores. At first, they met with resistance from some Germans. We have a captured letter from Minister of Justice Gürtner to Hitler, which is revealing in this. A Gestapo official had been prosecuted for crimes committed in one of these camps, and the Nazi governor of Saxony had promptly asked that the proceedings be quashed. The Minister of Justice, greatly to his credit, in June of 1935, this was protested because, as he called to the attention of Hitler himself, and I now quote the statement of the Minister of Justice, "In this camp, unusually grave mistreatments of prisoners have occurred at least since the summer 1933. The prisoners not only were beaten with whips without cause, similarly as in concentration camp Bredow near Stettin, until they lost consciousness, but they were also tortured in other manners, that is, with the help of a dripping apparatus constructed exclusively for this purpose, under which prisoners had to stand until they were suffering from serious purulent wounds of the scalp."
I shall not take time to detail the ghastly proceedings in these concentration camps. Beatings, starvings, tortures, and killings were routine. They were so routine that the tormentors became blasé and careless. We will show you in Discovery that one night in one of these camps, 186 prisoners were executed when they only had orders to kill 180. And another report describes how they made a mistake and sent 2 urns to a family when there was only 1 victim. Inmates were compelled to execute each other. In 1942, they were paid 5 Reichsmarks per execution, but on June 27, 1942, General Glucks ordered commandants from all concentration camps to reduce this honorarium to 3 cigarettes. In 1943, the Reich leader of the SS and chief of German police ordered that corporal punishment on Russian women be applied by Polish women and vice versa, but the price was not frozen. He said as a reward, a few cigarettes would be authorized. Under the Nazis, human life had been progressively devalued until it became as worthless as a handful of tobacco, ersatz tobacco. There were, however, some traces of the milk of human kindness. On August the 11th, 1942, an order went from Hitler to the commanders of 14 concentration camps that, I quote, "Only German prisoners are allowed to beat other German prisoners."
Mystery and suspense were added to cruelty in order to spread torture from the inmate to his family and friends. Men and women disappeared from their homes or businesses or from the streets, and no word came of them. The omission of notice was not due to overworked staff. It was due to policy. The chief of the SD and SIPO reported that in accordance with orders from the Fuhrer, anxiety should be created in the minds of the family of the arrested person. Deportations and secret arrests were labeled with a Nazi wit, which seems a little ghoulish. Nacht und Nebel, night and fog orders. One of the many orders for these actions gave this explanation. On the 2nd of February, 1942, an order was issued for the chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, in which the fields were advised that this decree carries a basic innovation. The Fuhrer and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces commands that crimes of the specified sort committed by civilians of the occupied territories are to be punished by the pertinent court-martials in the occupied territories. Only when A, the sentence calls for the death penalty, and B, the sentence is pronounced within 8 days after arrest.
Only when both conditions are met does the Fuhrer and the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces hope for the desired deterrent effect from the conduct of punitive proceedings in the occupied territories. In other cases, in the future, the accused are to be secretly brought to Germany and the further conduct of the trial carried on here.
I dislike to encumber the record with such morbid tales, but we are in the grim business of trying men as criminals, and these are the things that their agents say happened. We will show you these concentration camps in motion pictures, just as the Allied armies found them when they arrived. But the proof here will be so overwhelming that I venture to predict not one word of what I have now spoken will be denied. These defendants will only deny personal responsibility or knowledge. Under the clutch of the most intricate web of espionage and intrigue that any modern state has endured, and persecution and torture of a kind that has not been visited upon the world in many centuries, the elements of the German population, which were both decent and courageous, were annihilated. Those which were decent but weak were intimidated. Open resistance, which had never been more than feeble and irresolute, disappeared. But resistance, I am happy to say, always remained. Although it was manifest in only such events as the abortive effort to assassinate Hitler on July 20th, 1944. With resistance driven underground, the Nazi had the German state in his own hands. But the Nazis not only silenced discordant voices, they created positive controls as effective as their negative ones. Propaganda organs on a scale never before known stimulated the party and party formations with a permanent enthusiasm and abandon, such as we, democratic peoples, can work up only for a few days before a general election. Then inculcated and practiced the true principle with centralized control of the party and of the party's controlled state over the lives and thought of the German people, who are accustomed to look upon the German state by whomever controlled with a mysticism that is incomprehensible to my people. All these controls from their inception were exerted in unparalleled energy and single-mindedness to put Germany on a war footing. We will show from the Nazis' own documents their secret training of military personnel, their secret creation of a military air force. Finally, a conscript army was brought into being. Financiers, economists, industrialists joined in the plan and promoted elaborate altercation in industry and finance to support an unprecedented concentration of resources and energies upon preparations for war. Germany's rearmament so outstripped the strength of her neighbors that in about a year she was able to crush the whole military force of continental Europe, exclusive of that of Soviet Russia, and then to push the Russian armies back to the Volga? These preparations were of a magnitude which surpassed all need of defense, and every defendant, and every intelligent German well understood them to be for aggressive purposes.
Before resorting to open aggressive warfare, the Nazis undertook some rather cautious experiments to test the spirit of resistance of those who lay across their path. They advanced, but only as others yielded, and kept in a position to draw back if they found a temper which made persistence dangerous. On March 7th, 1936, the Nazis reoccupied the Rhineland and then proceeded to fortify it in violation of the Treaty of Versailles and the Pact of Locarno. They encountered no substantial resistance and were emboldened to take the next step, which was the acquisition of Austria. Despite repeated assurances that Germany had no designs on Austria, invasion was perfected. Threat of attack forced Schuschnigg to resign as Chancellor of Austria and put the defendant, Seyss-Inquart, in his place. The latter immediately opened the frontier and invited Hitler to invade Austria to preserve order. On March 12th, the invasion began. The next day, Hitler proclaimed himself chief of the Austrian state, took command of its armed forces, and a law was enacted annexing Austria to Germany.
Threats of aggression had succeeded without arousing resistance. Fears, nevertheless, had been stirred. They were lulled by an assurance to the Czechoslovak government that there would be no attack on that country. We will show that the Nazi government already had detailed plans for that attack. We will lay before you the documents in which these conspirators planned to create an incident to justify their attack. They even gave consideration, according to their own documents, to assassinating their own ambassador at Prague in order to create a sufficiently dramatic incident. They did precipitate a diplomatic crisis which endured throughout the summer. Hitler set September the 28th as the day when troops should be ready for action. Under the threat of immediate war, the United Kingdom and France concluded a pact with Germany and Italy at Munich on September the 29th, 1938, which required Czechoslovakia to acquiesce in the cession of the Sudetenland to Germany. It was consummated by German occupation on October the 1st, 1938. The Munich Pact pledged no further aggression against Czechoslovakia, but the Nazi pledge was lightly given and quickly broken. On the 15th of March, 1939, in defiance of the Treaty of Munich itself, the Nazis seized and occupied Bohemia and Moravia, which constituted the major part of Czechoslovakia not already ceded to Germany. Once again, the West stood aghast, but it dreaded war, and it saw no remedy except war, and it hoped against hope that the Nazi fever for expansion had run its course. But the Nazi world was intoxicated by these unresisted successes in open alliance with Mussolini and in covert alliance with Franco. Then, having made a deceitful and delaying peace with Russia, the conspirators entered upon the final phase to renew world war.
I am not going to prolong this address by detailing the steps leading to the war of aggression, which began with the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. The further story will be unfolded to you by the British delegation from documents including those of the German High Command itself. I speak only of the conspiracy aspects of the aggression. The plans had been laid long in advance. As early as 1935, Hitler appointed the defendant Scott to the position of General Deputy for the War Economy. We have the diary of General Jolt. The Plan Otto, Hitler's own order for attack on Austria in case trickery failed. The Plan Green, which was the blueprint for attack on Czechoslovakia. The plan for the war in the West. Funk's letter to Hitler on August 25, 1939, detailing the long course of economic preparation. We have the top secret mobilization order for 1939 or 40, prescribing secret steps to be taken during a period of tension, as it was described, during which no, quote, state of war will be publicly declared, even if open war measures against the foreign enemy will be taken. This latter order is in our possession despite a secret order issued on March 16, 1945, when Allied troops were advancing into the heart of Germany to burn these plans. We also have Hitler's directive, dated December 18, 1940, for the Barbarossa contingency, which was a code name outlining the strategy of the attack upon Russia. We have details, and that plan in the original bears the initials of the defendants Keitel and Jolt. They were planning the attack and planning it long in advance of the declaration of war. We have detailed information concerning the Case White, which is the plan for the attack on Poland. That began the war. This was on June the 14th. The attack did not come until September. It's a top secret document. Only 20 copies were circulated. We have number 8. It starts. Steps in preparation for the attack were taken by subordinate commanders, one of whom issued an order on June 14th, providing that the Commander-in-Chief of the Army has ordered the working out of a plan of deployment against Poland, which takes in account the demands of political leadership for the opening of war by surprise and for quick successes. It also provides that it is the duty of commanding general, divisional commanders, and commandants to limit as much as possible the number of persons who will be informed and to limit the extent of the information so that no person will get information of this plan.
We also have the order for the attack on England, initialed again by Keitel and Jodl. It is interesting that it commences by saying that although the British military position is so hopeless, they show not the slightest sign of giving in. As early as November 5th, 1937, Hitler told defendants Goering, Raeder, and Neurath, among others, that German rearmament was practically accomplished and that he had decided to secure by force, starting with a lightning attack on Czechoslovakia and Austria, greater living space for Germans in Europe no later than 1943 or 5, and perhaps as early as 1938. Not the least incriminating are the minutes of Hitler's meeting with his high advisors, which we have. These minutes were rather meticulously kept, as the Germans were apt to do, and the Führer advised his staff that it is a question of expanding our living space in the East and of securing our food supplies, over and above the natural fertility, thoroughgoing German exploitation will enormously increase the surplus. And he said, there is therefore no question of sparing Poland, and we are left with the decision, their own underscoring, to attack Poland at the first suitable opportunity. He adds, we cannot expect a repetition of the Czech affair. There will be war. Conclusive evidence. And when these men entered Poland, they knew they were precipitating war.
On August 22, 1939, Hitler again addressed members of the High Command, telling them when the start of military operations would be ordered. He disclosed that for propaganda purposes, he would provocate a good reason. But he added, it will make no difference. He announced whether this reason will sound convincing or not. After all, the victor will not be asked whether he talked the truth or not. We have to proceed brutally. The stronger is always right. It was at all times utterly hopeless for the Western powers to avoid war because Hitler was determined to make war. In his conference with all supreme commanders, dated November 23, 1939, he said this: for the first time in history, we have to fight on only one front. The other front is at present free, but no one can know how long that will remain so. I have doubted for a long time whether I would strike in the East and then in the West. Basically, I did not organize the armed forces in order not to strike. The decision to strike was always in me. Earlier or later, I wanted to solve the problem. Under pressure, it was decided that the East was to be attacked first.
We know the bloody sequel. Frontier incidents were staged. Demands were made for a cession of territory. When Poland refused, the German forces invaded on September 1st, 1939. Warsaw was destroyed. Poland fell. The Nazi, in accordance with plan, which will be developed more fully by my colleagues, moved swiftly to extend their aggression throughout Europe and to gain the advantage of surprise over their unprepared neighbors. And I might say, parenthetically, that in these remarks of Hitler's, he goes to some length pointing out that the powers of the West were unprepared and unexpectant of war. Despite repeated and solemn assurances of peaceful intentions, they invaded Denmark and Norway on the 9th of April, 1940, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg on the 10th of May, 1940, Yugoslavia and Greece on the 6th of April, 1941. As part of the Nazi preparation for aggression against Poland and her allies, Germany, on the 23rd of August, 1939, had entered into a non-aggression pact with Soviet Russia. It was only a delaying treaty intended, as the documents will show, to be kept no longer than necessary, to prepare for its violation. On June 22, 1941, pursuant to long matured plans, the Nazi hurled troops into Soviet territory without any declaration of war. The entire European world was aflame.
The extent to which Germany had incorporated territory and the extent to which it had occupied and controlled territory, now the Nazi plans did not stop at the point I have indicated. The Nazi plans of aggression called for the use of Asiatic allies, and they have found among the Japanese men of kindred mind of purpose. They were brothers under the skin. Himmler records a conversation that he had on January the 31st, 1939, with General Oshima, Japanese ambassador at Berlin. We have Mr. Himmler's original memorandum signed with his signature. He wrote, among other things, in this interview with Oshima, this. Furthermore, he, Oshima, has succeeded up to now to send 10 Russians with bombs across the Caucasian frontier. These Russians had the mission to kill Stalin. A number of additional Russians, whom he had also sent across, had been shot at the frontier. Exchanging secrets with the Japanese, on September 27, 1940, the Nazis concluded a German-Italian-Japanese 10-year military and economic alliance by their efforts in Greater Asia and regions of Europe respectively, wherein it is their prime purpose to establish and maintain a new order of things. On March 5, 1941, a top-secret directive was issued by the defendant Keitel. It stated this quote, "The Führer had ordered an instigation of Japan's military power has to be strengthened by the disclosure of German war experiences, and support of a military, economic, and technical nature has to be given. The aim was stated to crush England quickly and keep the United States out of war."
On March the 29th, 1941, the defendant Ribbentrop told Matsuoka, the Japanese foreign minister, that the German army was ready to strike against Russia. Matsuoka, in turn, reassured Ribbentrop about the Far East. Japan, he reported, was acting at the moment as though she had no interest whatever in Singapore, but, quoting, intends to strike when the right moment comes. On April 5th, Ribbentrop urged Matsuoka that entry of Japan into the war would, quoting, hasten the victory, end of the quote, and would be more in the interest of Japan than of Germany, since it would give Japan a unique chance to fulfill her national aims and to play a leading part in Eastern Asia.
The proofs in this case will also show that the leaders of Germany were planning a war against the United States from its Atlantic as well as instigating it from its Pacific approaches. A captured memorandum from the Führer's headquarters dated October the 29th, 1940, signed by General Falkenstein, asked certain information as to air bases and supply and reports. Here again, we do not speculate. We have the original documents signed by the general, and it says, dated October 29th, 1940, the Führer is at present occupied with the question of the occupation of the Atlantic Islands with view to the prosecution of war against America at a later date. Deliberations on this subject are being embarked upon here.
On December 7, 1941, a day which the late President Roosevelt declared will live in infamy, victory for German aggression seemed certain. The Wehrmacht was at the gates of Stalingrad. Taking advantage of the situation, and while her plenipotentiaries were creating a diplomatic diversion in Washington, Japan, without declaration of war, treacherously attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor and the Philippines. Attacks followed swiftly on the British Commonwealth, French Indochina, and the Netherlands in the Southwest Pacific. These aggressions were met in the only way that they could be met, with instant declarations of war and with armed resistance, which mounted slowly through many long months of reverse, until finally the Axis was crushed to earth and deliverance for her victims was won.
May it please your honors, I will now take up the subject of crimes in the conduct of war. Even the most warlike of people have recognized in the name of humanity some limitations on the savagery of warfare. Rules to that end have been embodied in international conventions, to which Germany became a party. This code had prescribed certain restraints as to the treatment of belligerents. The enemy was entitled to surrender and to receive quarter and good treatment as a prisoner of war. We will show by German documents that these rights were denied, that prisoners of war were given brutal treatment and often murdered. This was particularly true in the case of captured airmen, often my countrymen. On June 1st, 1944, it was ordered that captured English and American airmen should no longer be granted the status of prisoners of war. They were to be treated as criminals, and the army was ordered to refrain from protecting them against lynching by the populace. This order was sent out as a request of the Reichsfuhrer SS. I'm sending you the enclosed order with the request that the chief of regular police and the security police be informed. They are to make this instruction known to their subordinate officers verbally. It is not the task of the police to interfere in clashes between Germans and English and American terror flyers who have bailed out. The Nazi government, through its propaganda agencies, took pains to incite the civilian population to attack and kill airmen who crash-landed. Similarly, we will show Hitler's top secret order that commandos, regardless of conditions, were to be killed to the last man. In that case, we have original documents with the Führer's signature attached. We will show the circulation of secret orders to be passed orally to civilians. The enemy parachutists were to be arrested or liquidated. By such means were murdered, incited, and directed.
This Nazi campaign of ruthless treatment of enemy forces assumed its greatest proportions in the fight against Russia. Eventually, all prisoners of war were taken out of control of the army and put in the hands of Himmler and the SS. In the East, the German fury spent itself. Russian prisoners of war were ordered to be branded. They were starved. I shall quote passages from a letter written on February 28, 1942, by defendant Rosenberg to defendant Keitel. And this is what he said. The fate of the Soviet prisoners of war in Germany is, on the contrary, a tragedy of the greatest extent. Of 3,600,000 prisoners of war, only several hundred thousand are still able to work fully. A large part of them is starved or died because of hazards of the weather. Thousands have also died of spotted fever. The camp commanders have forbidden the civilian population to put food at the disposal of the prisoners, and they have rather let them starve to death. In many cases, when prisoners of war could no longer keep up on the march because of hunger and exhaustion, they were shot before the eyes of the horrified civilian population, and the corpses were left. In numerous camps, no shelter for the prisoners of war was provided at all. They lay under the open sky during rain or snow. Even tools were not made available to dig holes or caves. Finally, the shooting of the prisoners of war must be mentioned. For instance, in various camps, all of the Asiatics, and Asiatics is quoted, were shot.
Civilized usage and conventions to which Germany was a party had prescribed certain immunities also for civilian populations that were unfortunate enough to dwell in lands overrun by hostile armies. The German occupation forces, controlled or commanded by men on trial before you, committed a long series of outrages against the inhabitants of occupied territory that would be incredible except for captured orders and captured reports, which show the fidelity with which those orders were executed.
We deal here with a phrase of common criminality designed by the conspirators as part of the common plan. We can appreciate why these crimes against their European enemies were not of a casual character, but were planned and disciplined crimes only when we get at the reason for them. Hitler told his officers on August 22, 1939, that the main objective in Poland is the destruction of the enemy and not the reaching of a certain geographical line. Those words were quoted. The project of deporting promising youth from occupied territories was approved by Rosenberg on the theory that, quoting him, a desired weakening of the biological force of the conquered people is being achieved. To Germanize or to destroy was the program. Himmler announced, and I quote, "Either we win over any good blood that we can use for ourselves and give it a place in our people, or, gentlemen, you may call this cruel, but nature is cruel. We destroy this blood." That's the end of the quote. As to racially good types, Himmler further advised, and I quote again, "Therefore, I think that it is our duty to take their children with us, to remove them from their environment, if necessary, by robbing or stealing them." He urged deportation of Slavic children to deprive potential enemies of future soldiers.
The Nazi purpose was to leave Germany's neighbors so weakened that even if she should eventually lose the war, she would still be the most powerful nation in Europe. Against this background, we must view this plan for ruthless warfare, which means a plan for the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Hostages in large numbers were demanded and killed. Mass punishments were inflicted, so savage that whole communities were extinguished. Rosenberg was advised of the annihilation of 3 unidentified villages in Slovakia. In May of 1943, another village of about 40 farms and 220 inhabitants was ordered wiped out. The entire population was ordered shot, the cattle and property impounded, and the order required that, quote, "the village will be destroyed totally by fire." A secret report from Rosenberg's Reich Ministry of Eastern Territory, where he was responsible, reveals this, and I quote, "Food rations allowed the Russian population are so low that they fail to secure their existence and provide only for minimum substance of limited duration. The population does not know if they will still live tomorrow. They are faced with death by starvation. The roads are clogged by hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes as many as 1 million according to the estimate of experts, who wander around in search of nourishment. Sokol's action has caused great unrest among the civilians. Russian girls were deloused by men. Nude photos, forced positions were taken. Women doctors were locked into freight cars for the pleasure. I think its nurses were locked into freight cars of the transport commanders. Women in nightshirts were fettered and forced through the Russian towns to the railroad station, etc. All this material has been sent to the OKH.
Perhaps the deportation to slave labor was the most horrible and extensive slaving operation in history. On few other subjects is our evidence so abundant and so damaging. A speech of the defendant Frank, Governor General of Poland, made in January 25, 1944, boasts, "I've sent 1,300,000 Polish workers into the Reich." The defendant Sokol reported that, and I quote, "Out of the 5 million foreign workers who arrived in Germany, not even 200,000 came voluntarily." This fact was reported to the Führer and to defendants Speer and Göring and Keitel. Children of 10 to 14 years were impressed into service. We have the order in which, quote, "the commander is further charged with the transferring of worthwhile Russian youth between 10 and 14 years of age to the Reich."
When enough labor was not forthcoming, prisoners of war were forced into war work in flagrant violation of international conventions. Slave labor came from France, Belgium, Holland, Italy, and the East. Methods of recruitment were violent. Treatment of these slave laborers was stated in general terms not difficult to translate into concrete deprivations. In a letter to the defendant Rosenberg from the defendant Sokol, it is stated, "All the men, prisoners of war, and foreign civilian workers must be fed, sheltered, and treated in such a way as to exploit them to the highest possible extent at the lowest conceivable degree of expenditure. Doesn't take much imagination to translate that order into action.
And prisoners of war, the same order, the same captured order provides all prisoners of war from the territories of the West as well as the East, actually in Germany, must be completely incorporated into the German armament and munitions industries. A more flagrant violation of international law as to prisoners of war is inconceivable. But the order further provides the complete employment of all prisoners of war, as well as the use of a gigantic number of new foreign civilian workers, men and women, has become an indisputable necessity for the solution of the mobilization of labor program in this war. In pursuance to the Nazi plan permanently to reduce the living standards of their neighbors and to weaken them physically and economically, a long series of crimes were committed. There was extensive destruction, serving no military purpose, of the property of civilians. Dikes were thrown open in Holland, almost at the close of the war. Not to achieve military ends, but to destroy the resources and to retard the economy of thrifty Netherlanders.
There was carefully planned economic siphoning off of the assets of occupied countries. An example of the planning is shown by a report on France dated December 7, 1942, made by the Economic Research Department of the Reichsbank. The question arose whether French occupation costs should be increased from 15 million Reichsmarks per day to 25 million Reichsmarks per day. The Reichsbank analyzed the French economy to determine whether it could bear the burden. It pointed out that the armistice had burdened France, to that date, to the extent of 18.5 billion Reichsmarks, equaling 370 billion francs. It pointed out that the burden of these payments within 2.5 years equaled the aggregate French national income in the year 1940, and that the amount of payments handed over to Germany in the first 6 months of 1942 corresponded to the estimate for the total French revenue for that year. The report concluded, and I quote, "In any case, the conclusion is inescapable that relatively heavier tributes have been imposed on France since the armistice in June 1940 than upon Germany after the World War. In this connection, it must be noted, still quoting, that the economic powers of France never equaled those of the German Reich, and that the vanquished France could not draw on foreign economic and financial resources in the same degree as Germany after the last war." That is the end of the quote.
The defendant Funk was the Reich Minister of Economics and President of the Reichsbank that made that report. The defendant Ribbentrop was Foreign Minister. The defendant Göring was plenipotentiary for the 4-year plan. And all of them participated in the exchange of views of which this captured document is a part. Notwithstanding the analysis by the Reichsbank, they proceeded to increase the imposition on France from 10 million Reichsmarks daily to 25 million Reichsmarks per day.
Not only was there a purpose to debilitate and demoralize the economy of Germany's neighbors for the purpose of destroying their competitive position, but there was looting and pilfering on an unprecedented scale. We do not need to be hypocritical about this business of looting. I recognize that no army moves through occupied territory without some pilfering as it goes. Usually the amount of pilfering increases as discipline wanes. Exactly the contrary with the German army. If the evidence in this case showed no looting except of that sort, I certainly would ask no conviction of these defendants for it.
But we will show you that looting was not due to lack of discipline or to the ordinary weaknesses of human nature. The German organized plundering, planned it, disciplined it, and made it official, just as he organized everything else. And then he compiled the most meticulous records to show that he had done the best job of looting that was possible under the circumstances, and we have those records. The defendant Rosenberg was put in charge of a systematic plundering of the art objects of Europe by direct order of Hitler dated September 17, 1940. On the 16th of April, 1943, Rosenberg reported that up to the 7th of April, 92 railway cars with 2,775 cases containing art objects had been sent to Germany, and that 53 pieces of art had been shipped to Hitler direct, and 594 to the defendant Göring. The defendant apparently did 10 times as well in the collection of art objects as the Führer. The report also mentioned something like 20,000 pieces of seized art and the main locations where they were stored.
Moreover, this looting was glorified by Rosenberg. Here we have 39 leather-bound volumes tabulating the inventory, which in due time we will offer in evidence. One cannot but admire the artistry of this Rosenberg report. 39 volumes, such as I hold in my hand. The Nazi taste was cosmopolitan. Of the 9,455 articles inventoried, there were included 5,255 paintings, 297 sculptures, 1,372 pieces of furniture, 307 textiles, and 2,224 small objects of art. Rosenberg observed that there were approximately 10,000 more still to be inventoried. Rosenberg himself estimated that the values would come close to $1 billion. The inventory is typically methodical. A list of the objects dealt with in the particular volume and photographs of the great masterpieces of art looted from the cultural centers of Europe and shipped to Germany. 39 volumes. The one that I hold deals with paintings, sculpture likewise. Such was the looting that we're prepared to show in this case, not the looting of individual soldiers long away from home who help themselves to what comes at hand, but organized, systematic plans to loot Europe. I shall not go into further details of the war crimes and the crimes against humanity committed by the Nazi gangster ringleaders who are before you. It is not the purpose of my part of this case to deal with the individual crimes. I'm dealing with the common plan or design for crime. I will not dwell upon individual offenses. My task is to show the scale on which these crimes occurred and to show that these are men who are in responsible positions and who conceived the plan and design which renders them answerable, regardless of the fact that the plan was executed by others.
At length, this reckless and lawless course outraged the world. It recovered from the demoralization of surprise attack, assembled its forces, and stopped these men in their tracks. Once success deserted their banners, one by one the Nazi satellites fell away. Sawdust Caesar collapsed. Resistance forces in every occupied country arose to harry the invader. Even at home, Germans saw that Germany was being led to ruin by these madmen, and the attempt on July 20th, 1944, to assassinate Hitler, an attempt fostered by men of the highest station, was a desperate effort by international forces in Germany to stop short of ruin. Quarrels broke out among the failing conspirators, and the decline of the Nazi power was more even swift than its ascendancy. German armed forces surrendered, its government disintegrated, its leaders committed suicide by the dozens, and by the fortunes of war, these men fell into our hands. Although they are not, by any means, all the guilty ones, they are survivors among the most responsible. Their names appear over and over in the documents, and their faces grace the photographic evidence. We have here the surviving top politicians, militarists, financiers, diplomats, administrators, and propagandists of the Nazi movement. Who is responsible for these crimes if they were not?
The end of the war and capture of these prisoners present the victorious Allies with the question whether there is any legal responsibility on high-ranking men for acts which I described. Must such wrongs either be ignored or redressed in hot blood? Is there no standard in the law for a deliberate and reasonable judgment on such conduct? The charter of this tribunal evidences a faith that the law is not only to govern the conduct of little men, but that even rulers are, as Lord Chief Justice Coke put it to King James, under God and the law. The United States believe that the law long has afforded standards by which a juridical hearing could be conducted, so that we could make sure that we punish only the right men and for the right reasons. Following the instructions of the late President Roosevelt and the decision of the Yalta Conference, President Truman directed representatives of the United States to formulate a proposed international agreement, which was submitted during the San Francisco Conference to foreign ministers of the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the Provisional Government of France. With many modifications, that proposal has become the charter of this tribunal. But the agreement which set up standards by which these prisoners are to be judged does not express the views of the signatory nations alone. Other nations, which diverse but highly respect system of jurisprudence, also have signified adherence to it. These are Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Czechoslovakia, Luxembourg, Poland, Greece, Yugoslavia, Ethiopia, Australia, Haiti, Honduras, Panama, and New Zealand. You judge, therefore, under an organic act which represents the wisdom, the sense of justice, and the will of 19 governments, representing an overwhelming majority of all civilized people.
The charter by which this tribunal has its being embodies certain legal concepts which are inseparable from its jurisdiction and which govern its result. These, as I have said, are also conditions attached to the grant of any hearing to defendants. The validity of the provisions of the charter is conclusive upon us all, whether we have accepted the duty of judging or of prosecuting under it, as well as upon the defendants, who can point to no other law which gives them a right to be heard at all. My able and experienced colleagues believe, as do I, that it will contribute to the expedition and clarity of this trial if I briefly explain the application of the legal philosophy of the charter to the facts which I have recited. While this declaration of the law by the charter is final, it may be contended that the prisoners on trial are entitled to have it applied to their conduct only charitably, if at all. Of course, in codifying into a few paragraphs, many questions of application must be left unsolved. It may be said that this is new law, not authoritatively declared at the time they did the acts it condemns, and that this declaration of the law has taken them by surprise.
I cannot, of course, deny that these men are surprised that this is the law. They really are surprised there is any such thing as law. These defendants did not rely on any law at all. Their program ignored and defied all law. That this is so will appear from many acts and statements, of which I cite but a few. I have already called your attention to the Führer's remark before invading Poland, that the victor is never asked whether he spoke the truth. In the Führer's speech to all military commanders on November 23, 1939, He reminded them that at the moment Germany had a pact with Russia, but he declared, agreements are to be kept only as long as they serve a certain purpose. Later in the same speech, he announced, a violation of the neutrality of Holland and Belgium will be of no importance. A top-secret document entitled Warfare as a Problem of Organization, dispatched by the Chief of the High Command to all commanders on April 19, 1938, declared that, quoting, the normal rules of war towards neutrals may be considered to apply on the basis whether operation of rules will create greater advantages or disadvantages for the belligerents. And from the files of the German Navy staff, we have a memorandum on intensified naval warfare dated October 15, 1939, which begins by stating a desire to comply with international law. However, it continues, if decisive successes are expected from any measure considered as a war necessity, it must be carried through even though it is not in agreement with international law. International law, natural law, German law, any law at all was to these men simply a propaganda device to be invoked when it helped and to be ignored when it would condemn what they wanted to do. That men may be protected in relying upon the law at the time they act is the reason that we find laws of retrospective operations sometimes unjust. But these men cannot bring themselves within the reason of the rule, which in some systems of jurisprudence prohibits ex post facto laws. They cannot show that they ever relied upon international law in any state or paid it the slightest regard.
The third count of the indictment is based on the definition of war crimes contained in the Charter. I have outlined for you the systematic course of conduct towards civilian populations and combat forces which violates international conventions to which Germany was a party. Of the criminal nature of these acts at least, the defendants had, as we shall show, the clearest knowledge. Accordingly, they took pains to conceal their violations. It will appear that the defendants Keitel and Jodl were informed by official legal advisors that the orders to brand Russian prisoners of war, to shackle British prisoners of war, and to execute commando prisoners were clear violations of international law. Nevertheless, these orders were put into effect. The same is true of orders issued for the assassination of General Giraud and General Weigand, which failed to be executed only because of a ruse on the part of Admiral Canaris, who was himself later executed for his part in the plot to take Hitler's life on July 20th, 1944. The fourth court of the indictment is based on crimes against humanity. Chief among these, mass killings of countless human beings in cold blood. Does it take men by surprise that murder is treated as a crime? The first and second counts of the indictment add to these crimes the crime of plotting and waging wars of aggression and wars in violation of 9 treaties to which Germany was a party. There was a time, in fact, I think the time of the First World War, when it could not have been that the war inciting or war making was a crime in law, however reprehensible in morals.
Of course it was, under the law of all civilized people, a crime for one man with his bare knuckles to assault another. How did it come that multiplying this crime by 1 million and adding firearms to bare knuckles made it a legally innocent act? The doctrine was that one could not be regarded as criminal for committing the usual violent acts in conduct of legitimate warfare. The age of imperialistic expansion during the 18th and 19th centuries added the foul doctrine, contrary to the teachings of early Christian and international law scholars such as Grotius, that all wars are to be regarded as legitimate wars. The sum of these two doctrines was for a time to give war-making a complete immunity from accountability to law. This was intolerable for an age that called itself civilized. Plain people with their earthly common sense revolted at such fictions and legalisms so contrary to ethical principles and demanded checks on war immunities. Statesmen and international lawyers at first cautiously responded by adopting rules of warfare designed to make the conduct of war more civilized. The effort was to set legal limits to the violence that could be done to civilian populations and to combatants as well.
The common sense of men after the First World War demanded, however, that the law's condemnation of war reach deeper, and that the law condemn not merely uncivilized ways of waging war, but also the waging in any way of uncivilized wars, wars of aggression. The world's statesmen again went only as far as they were forced to go. Their efforts were timid and cautious and often less explicit than we might have hoped. But the 1920s did outlaw aggressive war. The reestablishment of the principle that there are unjust wars and that unjust wars are illegal is traceable in many steps. One of the most significant is the Briand-Kellogg Pact of 1928, by which Germany, Italy, and Japan, in common with practically all nations of the world, renounced war as an instrument of national policy, bound themselves to seek the settlement of disputes only by pacific means, and condemned recourse to war for the solution of international controversies. This pact altered the legal status of a war of aggression. As Mr. Stimson, the United States Secretary of State, put it in 1932, such a war of aggression is no longer to be the source and subject of rights. It is no longer to be the principle around which the duties, the conduct, and the rights of nations revolve. It is an illegal thing. By that very act, said Secretary Stimson, speaking on behalf of the United States, we have made obsolete many legal precedents and have given the legal profession the task of re-examining many of its codes and treaties.
The Geneva Protocol of 1924 for the Pacific Settlement of International Disputes, signed by the representatives of 48 governments, declared that a war of aggression constitutes an international crime. The Eighth Assembly of the League of Nations in 1927, on unanimous resolution of the representatives of 48 member nations, including Germany, declared that a war of aggression constitutes an international crime. At the Sixth Pan-American Conference in 1928, the 21 American republics unanimously adopted a resolution stating that a war of aggression constitutes an international crime against the human species. A failure of these Nazis to heed or to understand the force and meaning of this evolution in the legal thought of the world is not a defense or a mitigation. If anything, it aggravates their offense and makes it more mandatory, the law they have floated by vindicately by judicial application to their lawless conduct. Indeed, by their own law had they heeded any, these principles were binding on these defendants. Article 4 of the Weimar Constitution provided that the generally accepted rule of international law are to be considered as binding integral parts of the law on the German Reich. Can there be any doubt that the outlawry of aggressive war was one of the generally accepted principles in international law in 1939?
Any resort to war, to any kind of war, is a resort to means that are inherently criminal as means. War inevitably is a course of killings, assaults, deprivations of liberty, and destruction of property. An honest defense of war is, of course, legal and save those lawfully conducting it from criminality. But inherently criminal acts cannot be defended by showing that those who committed them were engaged in a war which was itself illegal. The very minimum legal consequence of the treaties making aggressive wars illegal is to strip those who incite or wage them of every defense which the law ever gave, and to leave war makers subject to judgment by the usually accepted principles of the law of crimes. But if it be thought that the Charter, whose declarations conceitedly bind us all, does contain new law, I still do not shrink from demanding its strict application by this tribunal. The rule of law in the world, flouted by lawlessness incited by these defendants, had to be restored at the cost to my country of over 1 million casualties, not to mention those of other nations. I cannot subscribe to the perverted reasoning that society may advance and strengthen the rule of law by the expenditure of morally innocent lives, but that the progress in the law may never be made at the price of morally guilty lives.
It is true, of course, that we have no judicial precedent for this charter. But international law is more than a scholarly collection of abstract and immutable principles. It is an outgrowth of treaties and agreements between nations and accepted customs. Yet every custom has its origin in some single act, and every agreement has to be initiated by the action of some state. Unless we are prepared to abandon every principle of growth in international law, we cannot deny that our own day has the right to institute customs and to conclude agreements that will themselves become sources of a newer and strengthened international law. International law is not capable of development by the normal processes of legislation, for there is no continuing international legislative authority. Innovations and revisions in international law are brought about by the action of governments such as those I have cited, designed to meet a change in circumstances. It grows, as did the common law, through decisions reached from time to time in adapting settled principles to new situations. The fact is that when the law evolves by the case method, as did the common law and as international law must do if it is to advance at all, it does advance at the expense of those who wrongly guessed the law and learn to late their error. The law, so far as international law can be decreed, had been clearly announced when these acts took place. Hence, we are not disturbed by the lack of judicial precedent for the inquiry it is proposed to conduct. The events I have earlier recited clearly fall within the standards of crimes set out in the Charter, whose perpetrators this tribunal is convened to judge and, if guilty, to punish fittingly. The standards for war crimes and crimes against humanity are too familiar to need comment. There are, however, certain novel problems in applying other precepts of the Charter which I should call to your attention.
A basic provision of the Charter is that to plan, prepare, initiate, or wage a war of aggression or a war in violation of international treaties, agreements, or assurances, or to conspire or participate in a common plan to do so is a crime. It is perhaps a weakness in this Charter that it fails to define a war of aggression. Abstractly, the subject is full of difficulty, and all kinds of troublesome hypothetical cases can be conjured up. It is a subject which, if the defense should be permitted to go afield beyond the very narrow charge in the indictment, would prolong the trial and involve us in insoluble political issues. But so far as the question can properly be involved in this case, the issue is one of no novelty and is one on which legal opinion has well crystallized.
One of the most authoritative sources of international law on this subject is the Convention for the Definition of Aggression, signed at London on July 3, 1933 by Romania, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Turkey, the Soviet Union, Persia, and Afghanistan. The subject has also been considered by international committees and by commentators whose views are entitled to the greatest respect. It had been little discussed prior to the First World War, but has received much attention as international law has evolved its outlawry of aggressive war. In the light of these materials of international law, and so far as it is relevant to this case, I suggest that an aggressor is generally held to be that state which is the first to commit any of the following actions. 1. A declaration of war upon another state. 2. Invasion by its armed forces with or without a declaration of war of the territory of another state. 3. Attack by its land, naval, or air forces with or without a declaration of war on the territory, vessels, or aircraft of another state. And 4th, provision of support to armed bands formed in the territory of another state, or refusal, notwithstanding the request of the invaded state, to take in its own territory all measures in its power to deprive those bands of assistance and protection. And further, I suggest that it is the general view that no political, military, economic, or other considerations shall serve as an excuse or justification for such aggressive actions, but exercise the right of legitimate self-defense, that is to say, resistance to an act of aggression, or action to assist a state which has been subjected to aggression, shall not, of course, constitute a war of aggression.
It is upon such an understanding of the law that our evidence of conspiracy to provoke and wage an aggressive war is prepared and presented. By this test, each of the series of wars begun by these Nazi leaders was unambiguously aggressive. It is important to the duration and scope of this trial that we bear in mind the difference between our charge that this war was one of aggression and a position that Germany had no grievances. We are not inquiring into the conditions which contributed to causing the war. They are for history to unravel. It is no part of our task to vindicate the European status quo of 1933 or as of any other date. The United States does not desire to enter into discussion of the complicated pre-war currents of European politics, and it hopes that this trial will not be protracted by their consideration. The remote causations avowed are too insincere and inconsistent, too complicated and doctrinaire to be the subject of profitable inquiry in this trial. A familiar example is to be found in the Lebensraum slogan, which summarized the contention that Germany needed more living space as a justification for expansion, at the same time that the Nazis were demanding more space for the German people. They were demanding more German people to occupy space. Every known means to increase the birth rate, legitimate and illegitimate, were utilized. Lebensraum represented a vicious circle of demand. From neighbors, more space, and from Germany, more progeny. We need not investigate the verity of such doctrines, which lead to constantly expanding circles of aggression. It is the plot and the act of aggression which we charge to be crimes.
Our position is that whatever grievances a nation may have, however objectionable it finds the status quo, aggressive warfare is not a legal means for settling those grievances or for altering those conditions. It may be that the Germany of the 1920s and 1930s faced desperate problems that would have warranted the boldest measures short of war. All other methods, persuasion, propaganda, economic competition, diplomacy, were open to an aggrieved country, but aggressive war was outlawed. These defendants did make aggressive war, a war in violation of treaties. They did attack and invade their neighbors in order to effectuate a foreign policy which they knew could not be accomplished by measures short of war. And that is as far as we propose or need to inquire, because that is as far as we accuse.
The Charter also recognizes individual responsibility on the part of those who commit acts defined as crimes, or who incite others to do so, or who join a common plan with other persons, groups, or organizations to bring about their commission. The principle of individual responsibility for piracy and brigandage, which have long been recognized as crimes punishable under international law, is old and well established. That is what illegal warfare is. This principle of personal liability is a necessary as well as a logical one if international law is to render real help to the maintenance of peace. An international law which operates only on states can be enforced only by war because the most practicable method of coercing a state is warfare. Those familiar with American history know that one of the compelling reasons for adoption of our Constitution was that the laws of the Confederation
which operated on constituent states, were found ineffective to maintain order among them. The only answer to recalcitrance was impotence or war. Only sanctions which reach individuals can peacefully and effectively be enforced. Hence, the principle of the criminality of aggressive war is implemented by the Charter with the principle of personal responsibility.
Of course, the idea that a state, any more than a corporation, commits a crime is a fiction. Crimes always are committed only by persons. While it is quite proper to employ the fiction of responsibility of a state or corporation for the purpose of imposing a collective liability, it is quite intolerable to let such a legalism become the basis of a personal immunity.
The Charter recognizes that one who has committed criminal acts may not take refuge in superior orders, nor in the doctrine that his crimes were acts of state. These twin principles working together have heretofore resulted in immunity for practically everyone concerned in the really great crimes against peace and mankind. Those in lower ranks were protected against liability by orders of their superiors. The superiors were protected because their orders were called acts of state. Under the Charter, no defense based on either of these doctrines can be entertained. Modern civilization puts unlimited weapons of destruction in the hands of its statesmen. It cannot tolerate so vast an area of legal irresponsibility.
Even the German military code provides, and I quote, "If the execution of a military order in the course of duty violates the criminal law, then the superior officer giving the order will bear the sole responsibility therefor. However, the obeying subordinate will share the punishment of the participant, 1, if he has exceeded the order given to him, or 2, if it was within his knowledge that the order of the superior officer concerned an act by which it was intended to commit a civil or military crime or transgression." Of course, we do not argue that the circumstances under which one commits an act should be disregarded in judging its legal effect. A conscripted private on a firing squad cannot be expected to hold an inquest on the validity of the execution. The Charter implies common sense limits to liability, just as it places common sense limits upon immunity. But none of these men before you acted in minor parts. Each of them were entrusted with broad discretion and exercised great power, and knew the purpose of the acts they were committing. Their responsibility is correspondingly great and may not be shifted to the fictional being, the state, which cannot be produced for trial, cannot testify, and cannot be sentenced. The Charter also recognizes a vicarious liability, which responsibility is recognized by most modern systems of law, for acts committed by others in carrying out a common plan or conspiracy in which the defendants have become a party. I need not discuss the familiar principles of much liability every day in the counts of countries associated in this prosecution. Men are convicted for acts they did not personally commit, but for which they were held responsible because of memberships in illegal combinations or plans or conspiracies.
Before this tribunal, as criminal organizations, are certain political and police organizations which the evidence will show to have been instruments of cohesion in planning and executing the crimes I have detailed. Perhaps the worst of the movement were the leadership corps of the Nazi Party, the SS, the SA, and the subsidiary formations which these include. These were the Nazi Party leadership, espionage, and policing groups. They were the real government above and outside of the law. Also accused as organizations are the Reich Cabinet and the Secret Police, or Gestapo, which were fixtures of the government but were animated solely by the party, except for a late period when some compulsory recruiting was done in the SS. Membership in all of these militarized organizations was voluntary. The police organizations were recruited from ardent partisans who enlisted blindly to do the work the leaders planned. The Reich Cabinet was the governmental facade for Nazi Party government, and in its members legal, as well as actual responsibility was vested for the program. Collectively, they were responsible for the program in general, Individually, they were responsible for particular segments of it. The finding which we ask you to make, that these are criminal organizations, will subject members to punishment to be hereafter determined by appropriate tribunals, unless some personal defense, such as becoming a member under duress, under threat to the person, to family, or institutement by false representation, or the like, can be established. Every member will have a chance to be heard in the subsequent forum on his personal relation to the organization, but your finding in this trial would conclusively establish the criminal character of the organization as a whole. We have also accused as criminal organizations the High Command and the General Staff of the German Armed Forces. We recognize that to plan warfare is the business of professional soldiers in all countries. But it is one thing to plan strategic moves in the event war comes, and it is another thing to plot and intrigue to bring on that war. We will prove that the leaders of the German General Staff and the High Command to have been guilty of just that. Military men are not before you because they have served their country. They are here because they mastered it, and along with these others, drove it to war. They are not here because they lost the war, but because they started one. Politicians may have thought of them as soldiers, but soldiers know they were politicians. We asked the General Staff and the High Command, as defined in this indictment, be condemned as a criminal group whose existence and tradition constitute a standing menace to the peace of the world. These individual defendants did not stand alone in crime and will not stand alone in punishment. Your verdict of guilty against these organizations will render prima facie guilty. As nearly as we can, learn many thousands of members in custody of the United States forces and of other armies.
To apply the sanctions of the law to those whose conduct is found criminal by the standards I've outlined is a responsibility committed by the Charter to this tribunal. It is the first court ever to undertake the difficult task of overcoming the confusion of many tongues and the conflicting concepts of just procedure among diverse systems of law so as to reach a common judgment. The tasks of all of us are such as to make heavy demands on patience and goodwill. Although the need for prompt action has admittedly resulted in imperfect work on the part of the prosecution, our great nations bring you their hurriedly assembled contributions of evidence. What remains undiscovered, we can only guess. We could, with witnesses' testimony, prolong the recital of crime for years, but to what avail? We shall rest the case when we have offered what seems convincing and adequate proof of the crimes charged without unnecessary accumulation of evidence. We doubt very much whether it will be seriously denied that the crimes I've outlined took place. The effort will undoubtedly be to mitigate or escape personal responsibility.
Among the nations which unite in accusing these defendants, the United States is perhaps in a position to be the most dispassionate, for having sustained the least injury, it is perhaps the least animated by vengeance. Our American cities have not been bombed by day and by night, by humans and by robots. It is not our temples that have been laid in ruins. Our countrymen have not had their homes destroyed over their heads. The menace of Nazi aggression, except to those in actual service, has seemed less personal and immediate to us than to European peoples. But while the United States would not be first in rancor, it is not second in determination that the forces of law and order be made equal to the task of dealing with such international lawlessness as I have recited here. Twice in my lifetime, the United States has sent its young manhood across the Atlantic, drained its resources, and burdened itself with debt to help defeat Germany. But the real hope and faith that has sustained the American people in these great efforts was that victory for ourselves and our allies would lay the basis for an ordered international relationship in Europe and would end the centuries of strife on this embattled continent. Twice we have held back in the early stages of European conflict in the belief that it might be confined to a purely European affair. In the United States, we have tried to build an economy without armament, a system of government without militarism, and a society where men are not regimented for war. This purpose, we know, can never be realized if the world, periodically, is to be embroiled in war. The United States cannot, generation after generation, throw its youth or its resources onto the battlefields of Europe to redress the lack of balance between Germany's strength and that of her enemies, and to keep the battles from our shores.
The American dream of a peace and plenty economy, as well as the hopes of other nations, can never be fulfilled if those nations are involved in a war every generation, so vast and devastating as to crush the generation that fights and to burden the generations that follow. Experience has shown that wars are no longer local. All modern wars become world wars eventually, and none of the big nations at least can stay out. If we cannot stay out of wars, our only hope is to prevent wars.
I am too well aware of the weaknesses of judicial action alone to contend that in itself your decision under this charter can prevent future wars. Judicial action always comes after the event. Wars are started only on the theory and in the confidence that they can be won. Personal punishment, to be suffered only in the event the war is lost, will probably not be a sufficient deterrent to prevent a war where the war makers feel the chances of defeat to be negligible.
But the ultimate step in avoiding periodic wars, which are inevitable in a system of international lawlessness, is to make statesmen responsible to law. And let me make clear that while this law is first applied against German aggressors, the law includes, and if it is to serve a useful purpose, it must condemn aggression by any other nations, including those which sit here now in judgment. We are able to do away with domestic tyranny and violence and aggression by those in power against the rights of their own people, only when we make all men answerable to law. This trial represents mankind's desperate effort to apply the discipline of the law to statesmen who have used their powers of state to attack the foundations of the world's peace and to commit aggressions against the rights of their neighbors. The usefulness of this effort to do justice is not to be measured by considering the law or your judgment in isolation. This trial is part of the great effort to make the peace more secure. One step in this direction is the United Nations organization, which may take joint political action to prevent war, if possible, and joint military action to ensure that any nation which starts a war will lose it. This charter and this trial, implementing the Kellogg-Briand Pact, constitute another step in the same direction, judicial action of a kind to ensure that those who start a war will pay for it personally. While the defendants and the prosecutors stand before you as individuals, it is not the triumph of either group alone that is committed to your judgment. Above all personalities, there are anonymous and impersonal forces whose conflict makes up much of human history. It is yours to throw the strength of the law back of either the one or the other of these forces for at least another generation. What are the forces that are contending before you?
No charity can disguise the fact that the forces which these defendants represent, the forces that would advantage and delight in their acquittal, the forces with which they have identified themselves and whose crimes they have committed, are the darkest and most sinister forces in society. Dictatorship and oppression, malevolence and passion, militarism and lawlessness. By their fruits we best know them. Their acts, as we shall recount them before you, have bathed the world in blood and set civilization back a century. They have subjected their European neighbors to every outrage and torture, every spoliation and deprivation that insolence and cruelty and greed could inflict. They have brought the German people to the lowest pitch of wretchedness from which they can entertain no hope of early deliverance. They have stirred hatred and incited domestic violence on every continent. These are the things that stand in the dock, shoulder to shoulder with these prisoners. The real complaining party at your bar is civilization. In all countries, it is still a struggling and imperfect thing. It does not plead that the United States or any other country has been blameless of the conditions which made the German people easy victims to the blandishments and intimidations of the Nazi conspirators.
But it points to the dreadful sequence of aggressions and crimes I have recited. It points to the weariness of flesh, the exhaustion of resources, and the destruction of all that was beautiful or useful in so much of the world, and to greater potentialities for destruction in the days to come. It is not necessary among the ruins of this ancient and beautiful city, with all untold numbers of its civilian inhabitants still buried in its rubble, to argue the proposition that to start or wage an aggressive war has the moral qualities of the worst of crimes. The refuge of the defendants can be only their hope that international law will lag so far behind the moral sense of mankind that conduct which is crime in moral sense must be regarded as innocence in law. We challenge that proposition.
Civilization asks whether law is so laggard as to be utterly helpless to deal with crimes of this magnitude by criminals of this order of importance. It does not expect that you can make war impossible. It does expect that your juridical action will put the forces of international law, its precepts, its prohibitions, and most of all, its sanctions on the side of peace, so that men and women of goodwill in all countries may have leave to live by no man's leave underneath the law.